Carl Jung explained. 8 spiritual reasons men struggle to express their true soul. There's a secret that's been kept from you your entire life, not by some shadowy conspiracy or hidden cabal, but by something far more insidious, by the very structure of society itself, by the people who love you, by every institution you've ever trusted, and most dangerously, by your own mind. Right now, as you listen to these words, you believe you're living your own life. You believe the thoughts in your head are yours, the desires in your heart are authentic, the identity you carry is real. But what if I told you that almost nothing about who you think you are is actually you? What if the person you see in the mirror every morning is an elaborate performance, a character you've been playing so convincingly that you've forgotten you're acting? This isn't metaphor. This isn't philosophy. This is the terrifying psychological reality that Carl Jung spent his lifetime trying to wake us up to. Jung discovered something that threatened the foundations of modern society, that human beings, and particularly men in our culture, are not living their own lives. They are living scripts written by forces they've never examined, performing roles they never consciously chose, imprisoned by invisible chains they themselves have forged and now defend with their lives. Listen carefully to what Jung said, because these words should haunt you. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, a kind of mask designed to make a definite impression upon others while concealing the true nature of the individual. Read that again. You are wearing a mask designed to make an impression, and that mask is concealing your true nature. The question that should be burning in your mind right now is, if I've been wearing a mask my entire life, who am I underneath it? And more terrifying still, is there anyone left underneath it at all? Most men never ask this question. They live their entire lives performing a character, chasing goals that aren't theirs, maintaining relationships based on pretense, building empires on foundations of sand, and they die never knowing who they truly were. They defend their prison because it's the only home they've ever known. They attack anyone who suggests there might be a door because the possibility of freedom is more terrifying than the certainty of captivity. But you're still here, which means something in you is ready to question. Something in you suspects that the life you're living isn't quite yours. Maybe you've achieved everything society told you to achieve and still feel empty. Maybe you look at your life and can't shake the feeling that you're watching someone else live it. Maybe late at night, when you're alone with your thoughts, you hear a voice, quiet, persistent, desperate, asking, "Is this all there is?" That voice is your soul, and it's been screaming at you your entire life, but you've been too busy performing to hear it. Here's what society doesn't want you to know. Everything you've been taught about being a man is a trap. The stoic silence, the relentless achievement, the emotional suppression, the independence at all costs, the conquest and competition and constant performance, all of it is designed not to make you strong, but to keep you contained, to keep you predictable, to keep you productive, to keep you from the most dangerous thing a man can do, become conscious of who he truly is. Because a man who knows himself, a man who has integrated his shadow, who has confronted his wounds, who has descended into his own darkness and emerged transformed, that man cannot be controlled. That man cannot be manipulated by shame or fear or the promise of approval. That man is dangerous to every system built on unconscious compliance. Jung called this journey individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, of integrating all the scattered, rejected, exiled parts of yourself into wholeness. But before you can individuate, before you can become yourself, you need to understand why you can't express your true soul. You need to map the prison you're living in. You need to see the chains, and that's exactly what we're about to do. Over the next 3 hours, I'm going to reveal to you the 8 spiritual blockages that are keeping you from your authentic self. These are not surface-level behavioral patterns. These are deep archetypal forces, psychological structures embedded in the collective unconscious, inherited wounds passed down through generations of men, and sophisticated defense mechanisms your own psyche has built to protect you from the terror of authenticity. We're going to explore the persona prison, how you've built an elaborate false self and forgotten it's not you. The shadow exile, how you've rejected vital parts of yourself into darkness, where they've become autonomous and dangerous. The anima suppression, how you've murdered your inner feminine and created a psychological half-being. The father wound, how you're living your father's unlived life and carrying dead men's trauma. The collective unconscious conditioning, how you're possessed by archetypal patterns that aren't even yours. The fear of the descent, how you're avoiding the necessary psychological death that precedes rebirth. The disconnection from the self, how you've lost the compass to your own soul. And the hero trap, how you've confused achievement with actualization and become addicted to a performance that's destroying you. This is not going to be comfortable. Real psychological transformation never is. Jung himself warned, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. If you're looking for feel-good affirmations or simple life hacks, leave now. But if you're ready to do the real work, if you're ready to see what you've been avoiding, if you're ready to stop performing and start living, stay with me. Because by the end of this journey, you're going to understand why you've felt like a stranger in your own life. You're going to see the invisible forces that have shaped you. You're going to recognize the masks you wear. And most importantly, you're going to be given a choice. Remain unconscious and comfortable, or wake up and become who you truly are. The second path is harder. It's lonelier. It requires you to sacrifice everything you thought you knew about yourself. But it's the only path that leads to freedom. So let me ask you, are you ready to question everything? Are you ready to see the truth about who you've been? Are you ready to meet the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding? If your answer is yes, then let's begin. Because the soul you've been searching for isn't out there somewhere. It's been buried inside you all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to excavate it. Welcome to the forbidden truth about your soul. Everything you thought you knew is about to change. Before we descend into the depths of each blockage, you need to see the map. You need to understand the architecture of the prison you're living in. Because here's what most men never realize. You're not dealing with one problem. You're dealing with an interconnected system of psychological chains, each one reinforcing the others, each one making escape seem impossible. Think of your psyche as a kingdom under occupation. The rightful king, your authentic self, your soul, has been overthrown and exiled. In his place, a puppet government rules, making decisions that benefit the occupiers while keeping you convinced you're free. These 8 chains are the mechanisms of that occupation. They're how the false self maintains power. They're why you keep sabotaging yourself even when you consciously want to change. Let me introduce you to your captors. Chain 1. The persona prison. This is the mask you wear, the character you play, the socially acceptable version of yourself that you present to the world. You put on this mask so long ago that you've forgotten you're wearing it. You've built an entire identity around this false self. Your career, your relationships, your self-image, all of it is based on a performance. And the most terrifying part? You've become so identified with the mask that you think it is you. When someone criticizes your performance, you experience it as an attack on your very existence. The persona prison is how you've traded authenticity for approval, and now you're trapped in a character you can never quite perfect, constantly exhausted from the maintenance, always one mistake away from exposure. Chain 2. Shadow exile. Everything about yourself that didn't fit the persona had to go somewhere. All the anger you weren't allowed to feel, the vulnerability you learned to hide, the desires that made you ashamed, the parts of yourself that people rejected, you exiled them into darkness. Jung called this the shadow, and it's not a metaphor. These exiled parts have become autonomous. They sabotage you from the unconscious. They leak out in your relationships, your compulsions, your self-destructive patterns. The shadow is why you can't stop repeating behaviors you hate. It's why you judge others so harshly for traits you secretly possess. It's why you feel like you're at war with yourself, because you are. The shadow exile is an internal civil war, and you're losing. Chain 3. Anima suppression. This one most men don't even know exists. Jung discovered that every man has an inner feminine, what he called the anima. She's your connection to emotion, intuition, creativity, relational depth, and spiritual vision. But patriarchal culture taught you that anything feminine is weakness. So you murdered her. You cut yourself off from half of your psychological wholeness. Now you're a half being, walking through life with emotional numbness, spiritual emptiness, compulsive projection onto women, and a terrifying sense that something vital is missing, but you can't name what. The anima suppression is why you can't access your deeper emotions, why your relationships feel hollow, why your life feels flat no matter what you achieve. You're not depressed. You're not broken. You're cut off from the source of life itself. Chain 4. The father wound. You didn't choose your father, but his unprocessed trauma is running your life. The father wound isn't about whether your dad was present or absent, kind or cruel. It's about the fact that he was human, which means he was wounded, which means he passed that wound to you. Now you're unconsciously living out his unlived life, replaying his patterns, carrying his shame, limited by his fears. Your career choices, your relationship dynamics, your self-criticism, your definition of success. How much of it is actually yours, and how much is you trying to heal him, please him, or prove him wrong? The father wound is why you feel like you're living someone else's life, because in many ways, you are. Chain 5. Collective unconscious conditioning. Jung's most radical discovery was that beneath your personal psychology lies something deeper, the collective unconscious, a shared inherited psychic structure containing the accumulated experiences of humanity. This means you're not just carrying your wounds, you're carrying generations of masculine conditioning, archetypal patterns, inherited fears, collective trauma. You feel shame about vulnerability, not because of your personal experience, but because you're plugged into centuries of masculine conditioning that equates vulnerability with death. Most of what you think are your personal beliefs about masculinity are actually collective programming running through you. You're possessed by archetypal forces you've never examined, living other men's nightmares without realizing they're not yours. Chain 6. Fear of the descent. Here's what no one tells you about transformation. You cannot become your authentic self without first dying to who you've been. Real change requires a descent into darkness, a psychological death, what Jung called the night sea journey, and you're terrified of it. You sense that to truly change, you'd have to let go of your identity, face your deepest fears, sit in the void of uncertainty, experience the dissolution of everything you thought you were. So you stay at the surface. You make superficial changes while avoiding the real work. You read books, watch videos, talk about growth, but refuse the actual descent. The fear of the descent keeps you in spiritual adolescence, always preparing for transformation, but never actually transforming. Chain 7. Disconnection from the self. Jung made a crucial distinction that most people miss. There's ego, your conscious personality, your sense of I. And then there's self, the central organizing archetype of the psyche, your true nature, the deeper wisdom that exists beyond your conscious identity. Most men have completely lost connection to the self. You make decisions based on fear, social conditioning, other people's expectations, ego needs, but you have no access to that deeper knowing, that inner compass, that soul-level guidance. You're like a ship without a rudder, blown around by every external wind, never quite sure what you actually want or who you actually are. The disconnection from the self is why your life feels meaningless, even when it looks successful, because you're living from ego, and ego can never be satisfied. It doesn't know the way home. Chain 8, the hero trap. You've been sold a lie about masculinity. You've been taught that your value comes from what you achieve, conquer, build, win. So you became a hero, relentlessly pursuing goals, proving your worth through performance, defining yourself through external success. And it's worked. You've achieved things. But here's the trap. The hero's journey is meant to be a stage of development, not a way of life. It's necessary for ego formation in the first half of life. But if you stay stuck in heroic identification in the second half, you become a caricature, a man who can't stop achieving because stopping means facing the emptiness inside. The hero trap is why you're exhausted, why rest feels like failure, why you keep moving the goalposts on success. You're running from yourself, and you've called that running ambition. These are your 8 chains. And here's what makes them so devastating. They work together. The persona requires shadow exile because you can't present a perfect mask while showing your darkness. Shadow exile requires anima suppression because the shadow often contains exiled feminine qualities. The father wound reinforces collective conditioning, which feeds the hero trap. The disconnection from the self makes you vulnerable to all the others, and the fear of the descent keeps the entire system locked in place. It's a sophisticated prison, and most men never even realize they're in it. But you're different. You're here because some part of you, probably the part you've been trying to silence, knows something is wrong. You've felt the chains, even if you couldn't name them. You've sensed the persona is false, even as you maintain it. You've felt the shadow moving beneath consciousness. You've mourned the loss of something you can't quite remember. That mourning is your soul crying out. So here's what I need you to do right now. Before we go deeper, before we explore each chain in detail, I need you to answer a question honestly. Look at those 8 chains. Which one hit you hardest? Which one made you uncomfortable? Which one did you want to skip past or dismiss? That's the one that has the strongest hold on you. Comment the number below, just the number, 1 through 8. Don't explain it, don't justify it, just name it. Because that number is going to reveal something crucial about your current stage of awakening. It's going to show you where your unconscious is most active, where your resistance is strongest, where your breakthrough is waiting. And as you do this, remember what Jung said. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Your fate is not inevitable. Your chains are not permanent, but you cannot break free from what you cannot see. So let's see them. All of them. One by one. Let's map the invisible prison so you can finally find the door. Let me tell you about David. David is 42 years old. He's a senior executive at a Fortune 500 company, 6-figure salary, corner office, beautiful home in the suburbs, wife, 2 kids, golden retriever. From the outside, David is the picture of success, the kind of man other men envy, the kind of man younger men aspire to become. But 3 months ago, David had a breakdown in his car. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies, the quiet kind. The kind where you're sitting in your driveway after work, unable to go inside, unable to move, staring at your steering wheel while your soul screams a question you can't answer. Who am I when nobody's watching? That question came from his teenage son. They'd been having dinner, one of those rare family dinners where everyone was actually present instead of lost in devices. And his son, 15 years old, looked at him and asked casually, like he was asking about the weather, "Dad, who are you when nobody's watching?" David laughed it off, made a joke, changed the subject, but that question lodged itself in his chest, like a splinter, working its way deeper every day until it reached something that couldn't be ignored anymore. Who was he when nobody was watching? He was professional David at work, confident, decisive, authoritative, slightly intimidating, always in control. He was husband David at home, reliable, steady, the problem solver, the provider, emotionally contained. He was Father David with his kids, approachable but not too close, supportive but not emotional, present but somehow distant. He was social David with friends, funny, successful, always had it together, never showed weakness. But who was he when the performance ended? When the office door closed and the family was asleep and the friends went home and there was nothing left to do but sit with himself in the silence? He didn't know. And that not knowing terrified him more than anything else in his life. Welcome to the persona prison. The first chain. And for many men, the strongest. Jung discovered something that should fundamentally change how you see yourself and everyone around you. He realized that human beings, especially in modern society, construct elaborate false selves, masks, personas, to gain approval, achieve success, and maintain belonging. We create characters that we perform so convincingly that we forget we're performing them. Listen to how Jung described it. The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is. Read that again slowly. The persona is that which you are not, but which you and others think you are. This is the foundation of the prison. You've built a false self. You've identified with it. You've convinced everyone around you that this is who you are. And now you're trapped maintaining a character that was never real to begin with. Here's how it happens. It starts in childhood. You learn quickly that some parts of you get approval and some parts get rejection. You're praised for being strong, criticized for crying, rewarded for achieving, punished for failing, accepted when you conform, isolated when you're different. So you do what any intelligent organism does. You adapt. You put on a mask. At first, it's conscious. You know you're performing. You're showing people what they want to see while hiding what they don't. But here's where it gets dangerous. Over time, you forget you're wearing the mask. The character becomes automatic. The performance becomes your identity. You're not consciously thinking, "I'm going to present my professional persona now." You just are professional David. The mask has fused with your face. And this is where the prison becomes escape-proof, because now any threat to the persona feels like a threat to your very existence. When someone criticizes your work, you don't experience it as feedback on what you did. You experience it as an attack on who you are. When you fail at something, it's not a temporary setback. It's evidence that you're fundamentally inadequate. When someone sees through the mask, it's not liberation. It's exposure, shame, terror. So you double down. You maintain the persona more rigidly. You perfect the performance. You build elaborate systems to protect the false self from being revealed. Let me show you something most men don't realize. You don't have one persona. You have multiple personas that you switch between depending on context, and each one requires psychological energy to maintain. Jung called this the persona maintenance cost, and it's draining you every single day. Think about it. You have your public persona, the face you show to strangers, acquaintances, the world at large. Confident, competent, put together. You have your professional persona, the identity you inhabit at work. Authoritative, knowledgeable, successful, slightly different depending on whether you're talking to subordinates, peers, or superiors. You have your intimate persona, the version of yourself you show to close friends or romantic partners. More vulnerable, but still curated, still controlled, still performing at some level. And beneath all of that, barely acknowledged, you have your secret self, the thoughts you don't speak, the desires you don't admit, the fears you don't show, the real you that nobody sees. And here's what's killing you. You're spending enormous amounts of psychological energy maintaining the barriers between these different personas, making sure your colleagues don't see the vulnerability you show your partner, making sure your partner doesn't see the ambition you show at work, making sure nobody sees the secret self. It's exhausting, and it's destroying your soul. David realized this during his breakdown. He realized he'd spent 20 years perfecting these different characters, and in the process, he'd lost touch with any authentic center. There was no real David beneath the masks, just more masks all the way down. Or so he thought. Because here's what Jung discovered that offers hope. The persona is not evil. The persona is necessary. You need social masks to function in the world. The problem isn't that you have a persona. The problem is when you identify with it completely, when you forget it's a mask, when the persona becomes autonomous and starts making decisions that contradict your soul's direction. Jung put it this way: the danger is that one falls for one's own persona when one identifies with it. Then the person becomes a kind of automaton, a rigid doll that has nothing individual about it. That's what had happened to David. He'd become an automaton, perfectly performing his various roles, but with nothing individual, nothing alive, nothing authentic animating the performance. And the worst part? He'd been rewarded for it. Society praised his persona. His career advanced because of his professional mask. His marriage functioned because of his husband persona. His social status depended on his public face. The persona had delivered everything it promised: success, stability, belonging. Everything except the one thing his soul actually needed: authenticity. So here's the question you need to ask yourself right now. How much of your life is performance? Not all of it. That's too easy to dismiss. But really examine it. When you speak, how often are you saying what you think others want to hear versus what you actually think? When you make decisions, how often are you choosing what looks good versus what actually resonates with you? When you're with other people, how often do you feel like yourself versus feeling like you're playing a role? Let me give you a framework for understanding this. I call it the 4-layer persona analysis, and I want you to do this honestly, even if it's uncomfortable. Layer 1, your public self. This is the identity you show to the world. Co-workers, acquaintances, social media. Ask yourself, what do people who don't know me well think I'm like? What image am I projecting? What would happen if they saw me at my most vulnerable, most uncertain, most human? Layer 2, your professional self. Who are you at work? How much of that is authentic expression versus strategic performance? What parts of yourself do you suppress to be successful? What would your career cost if you showed up fully authentically? Layer 3, your intimate self. Who are you with your closest people, partner, best friends, family? Even here, how much are you curating? What thoughts don't you share? What fears don't you admit? What desires don't you reveal? Layer 4, your secret self. This is the you that only you know. The thoughts in your head at 3 a.m. The desires you're ashamed of. The fears you don't speak. The real feelings beneath the performance. How different is this self from the others? And how much energy are you spending keeping it hidden? The distance between layer 4 and layer 1 is the measure of your prison. The wider the gap, the more trapped you are. David realized his gap was enormous. His secret self was terrified, uncertain, longing for something he couldn't name. His public self was confident, successful, fully in control, and the energy required to maintain that distance was destroying him from the inside. Here's what makes the persona prison so insidious. It's self-reinforcing. The more you invest in the persona, the more you have to lose by dropping it. The more successful your mask becomes, the more terrifying authenticity feels. The longer you've been performing, the less you remember who you are beneath the performance. And society loves your persona. Society rewards it. Everyone around you is invested in your mask because your mask confirms their masks. Your performance allows them to keep performing. If you suddenly became authentic, it would threaten everyone else's personas. That's why authentic people are often rejected, criticized, called selfish or crazy or irresponsible, because authenticity is contagious, and society's built on performance. Jung warned about this. The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, a kind of mask designed to make a definite impression upon others while concealing the true nature of the individual. The word complicated is key. This isn't a simple problem with a simple solution. The persona is woven into every aspect of your life, your career, your relationships, your self-image, your sense of worth. You can't just take it off like a Halloween mask, but you can become conscious of it. You can recognize when you're performing versus when you're being authentic. You can start making conscious choices about which situations require persona and which ones don't. You can begin the slow, difficult work of closing the gap between your layers. David started this work. He began noticing when he was in persona mode. At work, he caught himself performing confidence even when he felt uncertain. With his wife, he noticed himself maintaining the provider role even when he wanted to be vulnerable. With his kids, he saw himself being Father David instead of just being himself. And then he did something radical. He started taking small risks with authenticity. He admitted to his team that he didn't have all the answers. He told his wife he felt lost. He sat with his son and said, "You asked me who I am when nobody's watching. Honestly, I don't know, and that terrifies me, but I'm trying to figure it out." Did it feel uncomfortable? Absolutely. Did it threaten his carefully constructed image? Yes. Did some people react negatively? Of course. But something else happened too. The people who mattered most responded with their own authenticity. His team started bringing him real problems instead of performing competence. His wife shared vulnerabilities she'd been hiding. His son looked at him differently, not as an authority figure to either please or rebel against, but as a human being trying to figure life out. The persona started to loosen, not disappear. David still needed professional masks, social graces, appropriate boundaries. But the mask became conscious. It became a tool he used rather than an identity he was trapped in. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. Every time you judge someone for being fake, for being performative, for being inauthentic, you're recognizing your own persona. You can only see inauthenticity in others because you know it intimately in yourself. The person you criticize for being too polished or always performing is showing you your own mask. This is how shadow projection works through the persona. The traits you despise in others are often the traits you're unconsciously expressing. You hate performative people because you're exhausted from your own performance. You judge fake people because you're scared someone will judge you the same way. The personas you react to most strongly are mirrors for your own. So here's your practice, starting right now. For the next week, catch yourself performing. Notice when you're in persona mode. Don't judge it. Don't try to fix it immediately. Just notice. I'm being professional me right now. I'm being social me. I'm maintaining the mask. Awareness is the first step. You can't change what you can't see. And the persona is designed to be invisible. That's how it maintains power. But you're seeing it now. You're recognizing the mask. And that recognition is the beginning of freedom. Because here's what Jung promised and what David discovered. Beneath the persona, beneath all the layers of performance and pretense, there is a real you. A soul that existed before the masks, that's been waiting patiently behind the performance, that's been sending you signals your entire life, trying to wake you up. That breakdown in David's car, that wasn't a crisis. That was his soul breaking through the persona, forcing him to question, demanding to be heard. Your breakdown, whatever form it takes, is not a failure. It's your soul's desperate attempt to liberate you from the prison of performance. The persona is the first chain, but it's not the strongest. Because once you see it, once you recognize you're wearing a mask, the persona loses its power. It becomes a conscious tool instead of an unconscious prison. But remember, this is just the beginning. The persona is the surface layer. Beneath it lies something darker, something most men spend their entire lives running from. Beneath the mask lies the shadow. And that's where we're going next. Everything you hate about other people is you. I know you want to reject that statement immediately. I know you're already building arguments in your mind about why that's not true, why the people you despise are objectively terrible, why your judgments are justified, why you're different. That resistance, that's your shadow screaming. Let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus is 36, married, successful entrepreneur, active in his community, known for being peaceful, conscious, evolved. He meditates every morning, he reads philosophy, he talks about compassion, consciousness, and personal growth. By all accounts, Marcus is one of the good ones. But Marcus has a secret. Actually, he has several. He rages at his wife behind closed doors in ways that would shock everyone who knows him. He harbors violent fantasies about people who cross him in business. He feels intense disgust toward men he perceives as weak. He experiences sudden urges to destroy things he's built. And beneath his carefully cultivated peaceful persona, there's a pit of anger so deep he's terrified to even acknowledge it exists. None of his friends know this. His business partners don't see it. His social media followers think he's enlightened. Even his wife only sees a fraction of it. Marcus himself doesn't fully understand where this comes from or why, despite all his spiritual practices and personal development work. These impulses keep emerging. What Marcus doesn't understand is that he's at war with his shadow, and he's losing. Here's what Carl Jung discovered that changes everything about how you understand yourself. You are not just the person you think you are. You're also all the things you've rejected, denied, exiled, and condemned in yourself. These rejected parts don't disappear. They gather in the unconscious, forming what Jung called the shadow. And that shadow is not a metaphor. It's a living, autonomous aspect of your psyche that influences your behavior, sabotages your goals, and controls you in ways you don't even recognize. Listen to Jung's words carefully. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The less you acknowledge your shadow, the more powerful it becomes. The more you deny your darkness, the more it controls you from behind the scenes. So let's talk about how this happens, how you, a conscious adult trying to be a good person, end up with an unconscious monster sabotaging you from within. It starts in childhood like everything else. You came into this world as a complete human being, full of rage and tenderness, aggression and vulnerability, selfishness and generosity, cruelty and compassion. You were whole. You contained multitudes. But then you learned quickly that some parts of you were acceptable and some were not. Your anger was punished. Your sadness was mocked. Your vulnerability was exploited. Your desires were shamed. Your aggression was condemned. Your neediness was rejected. So you did what you had to do to survive and belong. You exiled those parts of yourself. You took the aggression, the neediness, the vulnerability, the shame, the desire, the rage, and you pushed them down into the unconscious. These aren't me, you told yourself. I'm not angry, I'm not weak, I'm not selfish, I'm not that. And that's where the shadow was born. But here's what you never realized. Those exiled parts didn't die. They didn't disappear. They gathered in the darkness, waiting, growing stronger, developing their own agenda. And now they're running parts of your life from behind the curtain. Marcus learned this the hard way. His shadow was formed from all the aggression and anger he had to suppress to be seen as good. Growing up, he learned that anger was dangerous, that aggressive boys were bad, that real men were calm and controlled. So he exiled his aggression. He built an identity around peace and evolved consciousness. But the aggression didn't go away. It went underground. And from there, it started expressing itself in ways Marcus couldn't control. He picked fights with his wife about trivial things, not realizing he was finding socially acceptable outlets for his exiled rage. He felt contempt for toxic masculine men, not recognizing he was projecting his own rejected aggression onto them. He sabotaged business deals at the last minute, unconsciously acting out the destruction his shadow wanted to unleash. He experienced road rage completely out of proportion to the situation, because his shadow was using minor triggers to express years of suppressed anger. This is how the shadow works. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up consciously. It manipulates you into expressing what you've exiled through projection, through unconscious behaviors, through self-sabotage. Jung explained it like this. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. Considerable moral effort. Because recognizing your shadow means admitting that you contain all the things you've been denying your entire life. Let me show you how to map your shadow. This is uncomfortable, but it's essential, because until you know what's in your shadow, you cannot integrate it, and what you don't integrate, you will act out. The Shadow Mapping System. Step 1. Identify your triggers. What makes you irrationally angry? What behaviors in others disgust you beyond reason? Who do you judge most harshly? What traits do you find absolutely intolerable? Write them down. These aren't random reactions. These are mirrors showing you your shadow. Marcus was triggered by men who expressed anger openly. He called them toxic and unevolved. But that disgust was a projection. He was seeing his own exiled aggression in them and condemning it to avoid facing it in himself. Step 2. Find the projection. For every trait you judge harshly in others, ask yourself, do I have this quality but express it in more subtle or socially acceptable ways? The answer is almost always yes. You're not judging them for having the trait. You're judging them for expressing it openly while you keep yours hidden. Marcus judged aggressive men, but he was aggressive, just covertly. Through passive aggression, through withholding, through sudden explosions behind closed doors. He had the same trait. He just kept it in shadow form where it was actually more destructive. Step 3. Reclaim the energy. Here's the crucial part most people miss. Your shadow contains enormous power, the aggression you've exiled. That's your capacity for healthy boundaries, for standing up for yourself, for protecting what matters. The selfishness you've condemned, that's your ability to prioritize your own needs. The vulnerability you've rejected, that's your capacity for intimacy and connection. The shadow isn't just bad traits, it's vital life energy that you've cut yourself off from. Reclaiming it means recognizing, yes, I have aggression and I need it, not to destroy, but to protect, not to dominate, but to stand firm. Step 4. Integrate consciously. Integration doesn't mean acting out your shadow impulses. It means bringing them into consciousness where you can work with them deliberately. Marcus didn't need to become an aggressive person. He needed to acknowledge his aggression and find healthy expressions for it, setting clear boundaries, speaking directly about conflicts, channeling that energy into competition or intensity where appropriate. This is shadow work, and it's the most important psychological work most men never do. Here's why the shadow is so dangerous when left unconscious. It doesn't just sit quietly in the dark. It actively sabotages you. It undermines your relationships. It creates self-destructive patterns. It ensures you keep repeating behaviors you consciously hate. Jung put it bluntly, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That addiction you can't break? Shadow. That relationship pattern you keep repeating? Shadow. That self-sabotage that shows up right when you're about to succeed? Shadow. That rage that comes out of nowhere? Shadow. That judgment that feels righteous but damages your relationships? Shadow. The shadow is not your enemy, it's you. It's the parts of you that you've been running from your entire life. And the running is what's killing you. Let me share something vulnerable here. For years, I judged people who were attention-seeking. I felt superior to people who needed validation, who performed for approval, who couldn't just be quietly confident. I built an identity around being above that kind of behavior, until I realized I was exactly the same. I was just doing it in more subtle, socially acceptable ways. Building a platform, creating content, needing engagement, measuring my worth by external validation. I had the same trait, the same need, the same behavior. I just dressed it up in spiritual language and called it service instead of attention-seeking. That was my shadow showing me myself, and it was humiliating to recognize. But that humiliation, that's the medicine. That's the moment when the shadow starts to integrate. When you can look at what you've been denying and say, yes, that's me too. I'm not above this. I'm in it. This is what Jung meant by considerable moral effort. It takes courage to admit you contain the things you despise. It takes humility to recognize your judgments are projections. It takes strength to face your own darkness without collapsing into shame or defensiveness. Most men never do this work. They spend their entire lives projecting their shadow onto others, condemning in the world what they can't face in themselves. They become self-righteous, judgmental, rigid, superior, all defense mechanisms against their own exiled darkness. And they wonder why their lives keep falling apart, why their relationships fail, why they feel at war with themselves. It's because they are. They're fighting a civil war against their own shadow, and there's no winning that war. There's only integration. Marcus started his shadow work when his wife threatened to leave. She told him, "You preach peace, but you're the most violent person I know emotionally. You judge everyone for their darkness, while yours is destroying our marriage from the inside." That was his wake-up call. That was his shadow being named by someone who could see it. He had a choice in that moment: defend, deny, project more intensely, or face it. He chose to face it. He started working with a Jungian therapist. He began the brutal work of recognizing his projections. Every time he judged someone, he asked, "What am I seeing in them that I've exiled in myself?" Every time he felt superior, he looked for the hidden inferiority he was compensating for. Every time rage emerged, he traced it back to the childhood wound where he learned aggression was unacceptable. Slowly, painfully, he began reclaiming his shadow. He acknowledged his aggression. He felt his rage fully without acting it out destructively. He set boundaries he'd been afraid to set. He stopped performing evolved consciousness and just admitted he was a flawed human working on himself. And something unexpected happened. He became more whole, more authentic, more powerful in a grounded way instead of a compensatory way. His marriage didn't just survive, it deepened. His business got clearer because he stopped undermining himself. His relationships improved because he stopped projecting. The shadow, once integrated, became his strength. This is what Jung promised. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You cannot transcend your shadow. You cannot spiritually bypass it. You cannot meditate it away or affirm it out of existence. You can only face it, acknowledge it, reclaim it, and integrate it. And here's the real teaching, the one most people miss. Your shadow contains your power. The very traits you've exiled are often the ones you most need for your authentic expression. The man who's exiled his aggression can't protect his boundaries. The man who's rejected his vulnerability can't experience intimacy. The man who's condemned his selfishness can't prioritize his own authentic path. The man who's denied his sadness can't feel joy fully. The man who's suppressed his desire can't create powerfully. Your shadow is not your enemy. It's your ally that you've been rejecting. It's trying to help you become whole. It's screaming to be integrated. But there's a warning here that must be spoken clearly. Shadow work is not permission to act out destructively. It's not an excuse for toxic behavior. It's not justification for harming others. Shadow integration means bringing darkness into consciousness, where it can be worked with deliberately, not unleashing it unconsciously onto the world. It means acknowledging your capacity for cruelty so you can choose compassion consciously. It means feeling your rage fully so you can express it constructively instead of passive-aggressively. The difference between an integrated shadow and an unleashed shadow is consciousness. One is power channeled deliberately. The other is destruction unleashed chaotically. Jung warned about this. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. When you deny your shadow, it becomes an enemy. When you acknowledge it, it becomes an ally. So here's the mirror effect for this chain. The traits you most condemn in other men are the parts of yourself you've exiled. The judgment you feel is the shadow protecting itself from being seen. The righteousness you experience is compensation for the shame you're avoiding. Every judgment is a mirror. Every trigger is a teacher. Every projection is an invitation to look inward. If you hate men who are weak, look for the vulnerability you've exiled. If you despise men who are arrogant, find the hidden grandiosity you're compensating for with false humility. If you judge men who are emotional, recognize the feelings you've suppressed. If you condemn men who are cold, see the emotional shutdown you're protecting. Your harshest judgments are maps to your deepest wounds. I want you to do something right now. Think of a man you know, someone you judge harshly, someone you feel superior to, someone whose traits disgust you. Got him? Good. Now finish this sentence. What I can't stand about him is that he's too, too. Whatever word you put in that blank, that's your shadow calling. That's the exiled part of you asking to be seen, to be acknowledged, to come home. Maybe you said weak. That's your rejected vulnerability. Maybe aggressive. That's your exiled power. Maybe attention-seeking. That's your suppressed need to be seen. Maybe selfish. That's your denied right to prioritize yourself. The trait you named is living in your shadow, and until you reclaim it, it will control you from the unconscious. This is the war with your darkness, and the only way to end the war is to stop fighting, to turn toward the shadow instead of away from it, to say, yes, I contain this too, it's mine, I'm willing to face it. That's courage, real courage, not the performative kind where you pretend to be brave, the actual kind where you face what terrifies you most, yourself. Marcus told me something profound near the end of his shadow work. He said, I spent 36 years trying to be good, and all that time I was just hiding from being whole. Goodness without shadow integration is just performance. It's persona. But wholeness, that's actually good. Not because you're performing virtue, but because you've integrated your darkness. and chosen the light consciously. That's the paradox at the heart of shadow work. You become good not by denying your darkness, but by facing it. You become powerful not by exiling your shadow, but by integrating it. You become conscious not by ascending above the darkness, but by descending into it and bringing light. The shadow is the second chain, and for many men, it's the most terrifying, because facing your shadow means admitting you're not who you thought you were. It means seeing the parts of yourself you've been running from. It means looking at the monster in the mirror and recognizing your own face. But here's what no one tells you. That monster isn't trying to destroy you. It's trying to save you. It's holding all the power, all the vitality, all the life force you've exiled, and it wants to come home. Your shadow doesn't want to hurt you. It wants to make you whole. So stop running, turn around, face it, say its name, reclaim it, because you will never be free until you stop being at war with yourself. And speaking of war, there's another battle most men don't even know they're fighting, the war against their own inner feminine, the anima you've murdered. And that's where we're going next. What I'm about to tell you will be the most controversial thing in this entire script, and your resistance to it will tell you everything about how deep this wound goes. Every man contains feminine energy, and patriarchal culture has taught you to murder it. Let me be absolutely clear before you check out. This isn't about gender politics. This isn't about being less masculine or more feminine. This is about psychological wholeness versus mutilation. This is about having access to half of your human capacities versus being cut off from them. This is about life itself. Let me tell you about James. James is 41, former military, infantry officer, combat veteran. After service, he became a successful business owner, construction company, 50 employees, multi-million-dollar operation, strong, capable, respected by his peers. Everything you'd call traditionally masculine. But James can't feel anything. He doesn't cry. He doesn't connect deeply with his wife. He can't access intuition or gut feelings. He only trusts logic and data. He has no creative outlets. His spiritual life is non-existent. His dreams are either violent or empty. His relationships feel transactional. And beneath all his success, there's a profound emptiness he can't name and doesn't understand. James isn't broken. James isn't depressed. James has committed psychological murder, and the victim is his anima. Jung discovered something that should fundamentally change how men understand themselves. Every human psyche contains both masculine and feminine energies. For a man, the inner feminine, what Jung called the anima, is as essential to psychological wholeness as the masculine. She is your connection to emotion, intuition, creativity, relational depth, and spiritual vision. She is the soul itself. But listen to what Jung said about what happens when men suppress her. The anima is the archetype of life itself. Life itself. Not some abstract concept, not a nice-to-have. Life. The very force that makes you feel alive, that connects you to meaning, that allows you to experience the fullness of human existence. And most men have killed her. Here's how it happens. From the moment you're born male in patriarchal culture, you receive a clear message. Anything feminine is weakness. Emotion is weakness. Vulnerability is weakness. Intuition is weakness. Relational sensitivity is weakness. Creativity is for others. Spirituality is for women. You learn that to be a man means to be the opposite of feminine. Hard, not soft. Logical, not emotional. Independent, not relational. Strong, not vulnerable. Aggressive, not receptive. Doing, not being. So you do what you're taught to do. You cut yourself off from those qualities. You exile them. You suppress them. You murder the feminine within you. And you call that murder becoming a man. But it's not becoming a man. It's becoming half a man. A psychological mutilant, a being cut off from his own depth. James learned this message early. His father taught him that boys don't cry. His military training reinforced that emotion is liability. His business culture rewarded him for being purely rational. Every system he moved through confirmed the same message. The feminine must die for the masculine to survive. So James murdered his anima, systematically, thoroughly, so completely that he forgot she ever existed. And the cost? Everything that makes life worth living. Here's what anima suppression creates in men: emotional numbness. You can't access your feelings. You're disconnected from the entire emotional range of human experience. Anger is the only emotion you can express because it's coded masculine. Everything else, sadness, fear, tenderness, joy, grief, is inaccessible. You move through life half alive, half feeling, wondering why nothing really moves you anymore. Compulsive projection onto women. When a man suppresses his anima, he projects her onto the women in his life. He makes them responsible for his emotional life, his creativity, his connection to meaning. Then he resents them for it. He idealizes them unrealistically, then devalues them when they fail to live up to the projection. His relationships become battlegrounds where he's simultaneously desperately attached and deeply resentful. Creative blockage. The anima is the source of creativity. When you suppress her, you lose access to imagination, inspiration, artistic expression, innovation. You become purely functional, productive but not creative, achieving but not creating. Your work becomes mechanical, your life becomes repetitive. Nothing new emerges from within you. Spiritual emptiness. The anima is the bridge to the unconscious, to the deeper realms of meaning and mystery. Without her, spirituality becomes impossible. You're trapped in materialist consciousness, in the purely rational, in the world of surfaces. You achieve external success, but experience internal desolation. You wonder why nothing feels meaningful, even when everything looks successful. Relational shallowness. Real intimacy requires the anima. She's your capacity for emotional attunement, for subtle communication, for depth connection. Without her, your relationships are transactional, surface level, functional but not intimate. You have a wife but no deep partnership. You have friends but no soul connections. You're surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. This is what James was experiencing. Success in every external measure, but dying inside. And he had no idea why, because he'd been taught that cutting off from the feminine was strength. It wasn't strength, it was suicide. Jung explained it clearly. The anima is a personification of all feminine psychological tendencies in a man's psyche, such as vague feelings and moods, prophetic hunches, receptiveness to the irrational, capacity for personal love, feeling for nature, and, last but not least, his relation to the unconscious. Read that list. Feelings, intuition, receptiveness, love, connection to nature, relationship with the unconscious. These aren't optional extras. These are core human capacities, and when you suppress them, you don't become more masculine, you become less human. But here's where the cultural lie gets exposed. Patriarchy tells you that embracing inner feminine qualities makes you weak, makes you less of a man, compromises your masculinity. The truth? The opposite is true. A man who has integrated his anima is more powerful, not less. He has access to the full range of human capacities. He can be strong and vulnerable, logical and intuitive, independent and relational, aggressive when needed and receptive when appropriate. He's not trapped in rigid masculinity. He's fluid, responsive, whole. Jung put it beautifully. The anima is the archetype of life itself. The more a man develops his consciousness, the more he must also allow his unconscious its say. That means the less he may identify himself solely with his masculinity. The path to greater consciousness requires anima integration. There is no wholeness without her. There is no individuation without embracing the inner feminine. So how do you do this work? How do you resurrect what you've killed? The Anima Integration Framework. Stage 1. Recognition. You must first acknowledge she exists. The anima is not metaphor. She's a living aspect of your psyche. She has her own personality, her own way of communicating, her own agenda. You've been ignoring her your entire life, but she's been trying to reach you through dreams, through inexplicable emotions, through attractions and projections, through that subtle voice you keep dismissing as irrational. James started here. In therapy, he was asked to pay attention to his dreams. They were full of female figures, sometimes threatening, sometimes seductive, sometimes wise, sometimes wounded. These weren't random images. They were his anima showing herself, trying to get his attention, revealing the state of his relationship with his inner feminine. She was angry in his dreams, destructive, because he'd been ignoring her for 4 decades. Stage 2. Dialogue. Once you recognize she exists, you need to learn her language. The anima doesn't speak in logic and data. She speaks in emotion, intuition, images, sensations. She communicates through feelings you can't rationalize, through hunches you can't explain, through creative impulses that don't make practical sense. Jung taught a practice called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with unconscious figures. James started this hesitantly. He would sit quietly and imagine his anima as an actual person, then ask her questions. What do you want from me? Why are you angry? What have I been ignoring? At first, nothing. Then slowly, responses emerged. Not his conscious thoughts, but something else. She told him she was exhausted from being suppressed. She showed him all the moments he'd chosen logic over intuition and been wrong. She revealed the grief he'd never processed, the fear he'd never acknowledged, the tenderness he'd exiled. This wasn't psychosis. This was psychological integration. He was creating conscious relationship with a part of himself that had been unconscious. Stage 3. Reconciliation. This is where the real work happens. You must grieve what you've done to your inner feminine. You must acknowledge the violence of suppression, the cost of denial. This requires deep humility, admitting you've been mutilating yourself, that the culture that taught you to suppress her was wrong, that you need what you've been rejecting. James had to face the profound grief of recognizing he'd spent 4 decades cutting himself off from life itself. All the moments he couldn't cry at his father's funeral, the times he chose work over connection with his kids, the creative dreams he dismissed as impractical, the spiritual longings he mocked as weakness, the marriage that almost died because he couldn't access emotional depth. He'd been committing slow suicide by anima suppression, and facing that reality was devastating, but necessary. You cannot heal what you won't face. Stage 4. Integration. Finally, you begin to consciously express the feminine qualities you've exiled, not by becoming less masculine, but by becoming more whole. You allow yourself to feel fully, to follow intuition even when it doesn't make logical sense, to create without needing it to be productive, to be receptive instead of always active, to value relationships as much as achievements, to connect with the sacred and mysterious. James started painting, not because it made sense, not because it served his business, but because his anima wanted to express through color and image. He started crying, ugly, deep, healing tears for all the grief he'd stored. He began trusting his gut feelings in business decisions and found they were often more accurate than his purely rational analysis. He practiced just being with his wife, without needing to fix or perform. He sat in nature without his phone, without agenda, just receiving, and slowly he came back to life. His employees noticed it. They said he seemed more present, more human, easier to approach. His wife felt the shift immediately. He was finally emotionally available, finally capable of intimacy, finally there instead of just physically present but psychologically absent. James didn't become less masculine, he became whole, and that wholeness made him more powerful, not less. Now here's what most men need to understand about this work. You cannot do anima integration from the head. You cannot think your way into wholeness. The anima speaks a different language than rational consciousness. She communicates through the body, through emotion, through creative expression, through dreams, through nature, through relationship. This is why purely intellectual approaches to personal development fail for men. You can read all the books, understand all the concepts, have all the theoretical knowledge, but if you're not actually feeling, creating, intuiting, relating, you're not integrating the anima. You're just adding more masculine, rational knowledge about the feminine, which isn't the same as actually embodying her wisdom. Jung was explicit about this. The meeting with oneself is, at first, the meeting with one's own shadow. But behind the shadow lies the anima, and the meeting with her is perhaps even more important, even if it is more difficult. More difficult, because the shadow at least speaks the same language as ego consciousness, but the anima speaks a completely different language. To integrate her, you must learn to think with your heart, to trust your gut, to follow your intuition, to value the irrational and mysterious. For men raised in pure rationality, this is like learning a foreign language while blindfolded. But it's necessary, because without the anima, you cannot individuate, you cannot become whole. You remain trapped in one-sided consciousness, powerful perhaps but incomplete, successful maybe but unfulfilled, functional certainly but not fully alive. Let me address the fear that comes up for every man when this topic arises. If I embrace my inner feminine, will I become weak? Will I lose my masculinity? Will I be taken advantage of? Will people respect me less? This fear is understandable, because culture has taught you that masculine and feminine are opposites, that gaining one means losing the other, that wholeness is somehow weakness. But Jung revealed this as false. Masculine and feminine aren't opposites, they're complements. They're two poles of human wholeness that must be integrated, not chosen between. A man who integrates his anima doesn't lose his masculinity. He gains access to the full spectrum of human capacities. He can be fierce and tender, structured and flowing, rational and intuitive, leading and receiving, active and receptive, strong and vulnerable. He's not weak, he's flexible. He's not less masculine, he's more complete. He's not compromised, he's whole. And here's the paradox. A man who has integrated his anima is actually more attractive to the feminine, not less, because he's no longer projecting onto women, no longer needing them to carry his rejected qualities, no longer making them responsible for his emotional life. He's whole within himself, which creates space for genuine partnership instead of desperate dependency. The women in James's life responded powerfully to his integration work. His wife said it was like meeting him for the first time. His daughters, who had always kept him at emotional distance, began opening up to him. Even his business relationships with female colleagues deepened because he was finally capable of emotional intelligence and relational nuance. The anima integration didn't make him weak, it made him real. But I need to give a warning here because this work can be misused. Anima integration is not about fetishizing the feminine. It's not about putting women on pedestals or idealizing femininity. It's not about becoming a spiritual man who performs sensitivity to attract women. It's not about appropriating feminine culture or pretending you're somehow in touch with the goddess. That's spiritual bypassing. That's using psychological concepts to maintain persona. That's shadow work in reverse. Real anima integration is humble, private, and internal. It's about your relationship with your own inner feminine, not about performing evolved masculinity for external validation. It's about becoming whole for yourself, not to be perceived a certain way by others. Jung warned about this. The anima is projected first on the mother, then on the lover, then on differentiated feminine figures. But the task is to withdraw all such projections and realize her as an internal figure. Internal, not external. The work is inward. You're not trying to understand women better. You're trying to understand yourself more completely. You're not learning to relate to the feminine out there. You're learning to relate to the feminine within. This is crucial because men who skip this distinction end up performing evolved masculinity while still suppressing their actual inner feminine. They read the books, use the language, appear conscious, but they haven't actually done the integration work. They're just building a new persona, the sensitive man mask, while the anima remains exiled. How do you know if you're doing real work versus performance? Check your projections. If you're still making women responsible for your emotional life, you haven't integrated your anima. If you're still idealizing women as more evolved or spiritual than men, you haven't integrated your anima. If you still can't access emotion without a woman present to facilitate it, you haven't integrated your anima. If your spirituality depends on external feminine figures or goddesses, you haven't integrated your anima. Real integration means you have access to emotional depth, intuitive knowing, creative expression, spiritual connection, and relational sensitivity, whether anyone else is present or not. These capacities are yours. They live within you. They don't depend on external feminine figures to activate them. James discovered this distinction painfully. At first, he thought anima work meant understanding his wife better, being more sensitive to her needs, performing emotional availability. That was still persona, good husband mask. It wasn't integration. Real integration happened when he was alone, when he could sit with his own emotions without needing her to process them, when he could access intuition in solitude, when he could create without audience, when he could feel tenderness toward himself, not just toward others. That's when the anima truly integrated, not when he was performing sensitivity, but when he was actually whole within himself. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. The women you're attracted to, the feminine qualities you seek in others, the ways you idealize or devalue the feminine, all of it is showing you your relationship with your inner anima. If you're attracted to women who are emotionally expressive, it's because you've exiled your own emotionality. If you seek women who are intuitive, it's because you've cut off your own intuition. If you need women to bring creativity or spirituality into your life, it's because you've suppressed those capacities in yourself. Your attraction patterns are maps to your anima wounds, and conversely, the feminine qualities that repel you or make you uncomfortable. Those are the aspects of your own anima you've most violently rejected. If emotional women irritate you, you've exiled your own emotions most thoroughly. If irrational behavior triggers you, you've suppressed your own intuitive knowing. If feminine spirituality seems foolish to you, you've cut yourself off from the sacred and mysterious within. Your judgments of the feminine reveal your inner violence toward your anima. This work is not optional if you want wholeness. You cannot individuate without anima integration. Jung was absolutely clear. The anima is the archetype of life itself. Life itself, not success, not achievement, not masculine power. Life, the thing that makes existence meaningful, relationships deep, creativity flowing, spirituality real, emotion accessible, intuition available. Every man who suppresses his anima is choosing death over life. Slowly, subtly, but inevitably. James told me something at the end of his integration work that I'll never forget. He said, "I spent 41 years trying to be a man by killing everything feminine in me, and I didn't become a man. I became a machine, functional but not alive, productive but not creative, strong but not whole. The Anima didn't make me weak when I integrated her. She made me human again. That's the truth patriarchy doesn't want you to know. The feminine isn't your enemy. She's your completion. She's not weakness to be overcome. She's wisdom to be embodied. She's not a threat to your masculinity. She's the key to your wholeness. So let me ask you directly, what feminine qualities have you exiled? What aspects of emotion, intuition, creativity, receptivity, or relational depth have you cut yourself off from? What would it cost to reclaim them? And more importantly, what is it costing you not to? The Anima is the third chain. And for many men, it's the most buried, the most denied, the most defended against. Because facing her means facing the violence you've committed against yourself. It means admitting that the culture that taught you to suppress her was wrong. It means grieving all the years you lived half alive. But she's waiting. She's always been waiting. Patient, persistent, calling to you through dreams you don't remember, intuitions you dismiss, creative impulses you suppress, emotional depths you avoid. She's not trying to punish you. She's trying to save you. She's holding the key to life itself. And she's ready to come home the moment you're ready to welcome her. But here's what you need to understand. Even if you do this work, even if you integrate your shadow and your anima, there's still another force controlling you from the unconscious. A wound so deep that it shapes your entire relationship with masculine identity, with authority, with purpose, with your very sense of self. It's the wound that came first, the original betrayal, the first masculine relationship that shaped all the others. It's your father wound, and that's where we're descending next. You are living your father's unlived life. Let that sink in before you reject it, before you say, "Not me. My father wasn't like that. My situation is different." Because that's exactly what every man says right before he discovers the depth of this wound. Let me tell you about Robert. Robert is 38, successful attorney, partner track at a prestigious firm, working 80-hour weeks, driven, ambitious, respected in his field. He looks nothing like his father, a small-town mechanic who struggled financially his entire life, who worked with his hands instead of his mind, who never achieved anything Robert would call success. Robert thought he'd escaped his father's life. He thought his choices were his own. He thought he'd become his own man, until his therapist asked him one question: why law? Robert's first answer came automatically. "I'm good at it. It's prestigious. It pays well. I wanted to make something of myself." But his therapist pressed, "Whose voice is saying those words? Whose definition of something are you using? Who decided that law was better than mechanics?" Robert sat in silence for a long time. Then he started to cry, because he realized every single decision he'd made about his career, his life path, his definition of success was a reaction to his father. He wasn't living his own life. He was living the opposite of his father's life, which is just another way of letting his father control him. He'd spent 20 years trying to be nothing like his father, which meant his father was still writing the script. This is the father wound, and almost every man carries it, whether he knows it or not. Jung discovered something that changes everything about how you understand masculine identity. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. The unlived life of the parent. Your father didn't just pass on his wisdom, his values, his strengths. He passed on his wounds, his unprocessed trauma, his unlived potential, his suppressed desires, his rejected parts. And now you're carrying them. You're acting them out. You're either repeating his patterns or overcompensating for them. But either way, his psychology is running in your unconscious, shaping your choices, limiting your possibilities. Most men never realize this. They think they've become their own person. They point to the ways they're different from their father. But different isn't free. Reaction isn't liberation. Running from your father's shadow is still letting him control your direction. Here's how the father wound forms and why almost no one escapes it. Your father was your first model of masculinity. Before you had language, before you had conscious thought, you were learning what it means to be a man by observing him. His relationship with emotion taught you how men feel. His relationship with power taught you how men lead. His relationship with vulnerability taught you what men show and what they hide. His relationship with your mother taught you how men relate to women. His relationship with his own father was passed down to shape his relationship with you, and your father was wounded. This isn't a judgment, it's a fact. Every human is wounded, which means every father passes wounds to his children. Your father received his wounds from his father, who received them from his father in an unbroken chain of intergenerational trauma, stretching back generations. The father wound isn't about whether your dad was good or bad, present or absent, loving or cruel. It's about the fact that he was human, which means he was limited, which means he couldn't give you everything you needed to become fully yourself. Jung explained it this way: the father is the representative of the spirit, of the collective consciousness. He is the natural carrier of the traditional spirit of law and order. Your father represented the masculine principle to you. He was your gateway to understanding masculine identity, masculine power, masculine purpose. But here's the problem. If his masculine identity was wounded, distorted, incomplete, or traumatized, that's what got transmitted to you. Let me break down the 4 primary father wound types. Most men carry at least one, often several. The absent father wound. Physical or emotional unavailability. Maybe he was gone, working constantly, traveling, divorced and distant. Or maybe he was physically present but emotionally absent, in the house but disconnected, available logistically but not intimately. This wound creates men who struggle with intimacy, who don't know how to be emotionally present, who replicate their father's distance in their own relationships. You learned that masculine love means providing but not connecting. You learned that fathers, that men, are functionally useful but emotionally unavailable. Robert's father was this type, physically present but emotionally vacant. He worked in the garage, came home tired, ate dinner in silence, watched TV, went to bed. He never asked Robert about his inner life, never shared his own feelings, never taught emotional intelligence because he didn't have it himself. Robert learned that men are silent providers, nothing more. Now Robert works 80-hour weeks, comes home exhausted, struggles to connect with his wife and kids, repeats the exact pattern he swore he'd never repeat. The critical father wound, the internalized harsh judge. Maybe your father criticized constantly, or maybe he criticized rarely but devastatingly. Either way, you internalized his voice. Now that voice lives in your head, judging everything you do, telling you you're not enough, finding fault no matter how much you achieve. This wound creates men who are driven by inadequacy, who can never rest because rest means facing the internal critic, who are successful externally but tormented internally. Every time Robert finished a case, won a trial, got recognition, instead of satisfaction, he heard his father's voice. Not bad, could have been better. His father never said those exact words, but the emotional tone, the withholding of approval, the sense that nothing was ever quite good enough, that became Robert's internal reality. Now he's partner track, but the internal father is already saying it's not enough. He should be making equity partner. He should be starting his own firm. He should be more successful than his colleagues. The critical father wound means you're running from shame that isn't even yours. You're trying to finally get approval from a voice that can never be satisfied because it's not actually about you. It's your father's self-criticism that he projected onto you, that you now project onto yourself. The weak father wound, lack of masculine modeling. Maybe your father was passive, dominated by your mother, unable to set boundaries, weak-willed, ineffectual. You never learned what healthy masculine strength looks like because he didn't model it. This wound creates men who struggle with authority, who can't stand up for themselves, who fear their own power, who either become passive like their father or overcompensate with false aggression. Some men respond to this wound by becoming exactly like their father, passive, uncertain, unable to lead. Others overcompensate, becoming hypermasculine, domineering, aggressive as a defense against the terror of being weak like dad. But both responses are reactions to the same wound. Both are still controlled by the father's weakness. The tyrannical father wound, power through domination. Maybe your father ruled through intimidation, violence, authoritarian control. He taught you that masculine power means domination, that leadership means fear, that strength means making others submit. This wound creates men who either become tyrants themselves or who are terrified of their own authority, unable to lead because leadership equals abuse in their psyche. Men with this wound often swing between two extremes. Either they become their father, domineering, controlling, using power destructively, or they become powerless in reaction, afraid to assert themselves, unable to set boundaries, terrified that any show of strength makes them the monster. Robert didn't have this wound directly, but his father did. Robert's grandfather was a violent alcoholic who terrorized his family. Robert's father responded by becoming emotionally absent and passive, the exact opposite, and Robert, seeing his father's weakness, became driven and ambitious. 3 generations, each one reacting to the father before, none of them actually free. This is how the father wound works across generations. It's not just your relationship with your father, it's your father's relationship with his father transmitted to you. Intergenerational trauma passed down like genetic material, shaping behavior unconsciously. Jung saw this clearly. The father is the first carrier of the Anima image, and he impresses this image on his daughter. If the daughter remains unconsciously bound to her father, she seeks the father in every man. Similarly, the son seeks his mother in every woman. But it goes deeper than that. The son also seeks resolution of his father wound in every authority figure, every mentor, every boss, every spiritual teacher. He's trying to finally get what his father couldn't give him: approval, guidance, modeling, blessing. And when these figures inevitably fail to heal the wound, he's disappointed, angry, disillusioned, because he's asking them to be the father he never had, which is impossible. Robert realized he'd been doing this with senior partners at his firm. He worked desperately for their approval, felt devastated when they criticized him, anxious when they withheld recognition. He thought it was about his career. It wasn't. It was about his father. He was still that boy trying to get his emotionally absent father to see him, approve of him, be proud of him. The father wound creates what Jung called puer aeternus, the eternal boy, a man who chronologically ages but psychologically remains a son, never quite becoming his own man, always positioning himself in relation to father figures, never establishing his own autonomous masculine identity. Here's how you know if you're trapped in pure psychology. You're waiting for permission to fully be yourself. You're seeking approval from authorities. You're trying to prove something to someone, even if you can't name who. You feel like you haven't quite become an adult, even though you're decades into adulthood. You sabotage yourself right at the edge of true success, because actually surpassing your father feels like betrayal. That last one is crucial and rarely discussed. Many men unconsciously limit their own success to match or slightly exceed their father's, but never dramatically surpass him, because unconsciously, totally surpassing your father feels like killing him, replacing him, proving him inadequate. The love and loyalty you feel for him, even if he wounded you, prevents you from fully actualizing your own potential. Robert discovered this when his therapist asked, "What would it mean if you became more successful than your father ever could have imagined?" Robert's immediate feeling was guilt, shame, like he'd be abandoning his father, proving his father's life was meaningless, saying his father wasn't enough. Even though consciously Robert wanted success, unconsciously he was limiting himself out of loyalty to his father's limitations. This is the father wound at its deepest level. You're not just carrying his trauma, you're protecting his dignity by limiting yourself to his scale of possibility. So how do you heal this? How do you separate his story from yours? How do you finally become your own man? The father wound healing process. Step 1. Grieve the father you needed but didn't have. You must first acknowledge that your father, no matter how good he was, couldn't give you everything you needed, not because he was evil, but because he was human. He was limited by his own wounds, his own father wound, his generation's conditioning, his personal trauma. You needed a father who was emotionally available, who saw you fully, who blessed your unique path, who modeled integrated masculinity, who could hold space for your full humanity. Most men didn't get that father, not because their fathers were villains, but because wounded fathers can't give what they don't have. Grieving this is essential, not in a victim way, but in an honest way, acknowledging, I needed more than I got, and that shaped me, and I'm carrying wounds because of it. Robert had to grieve. Grieve that his father never asked him about his inner life. Grieve that his father never showed him how to be emotionally present. Grieve that his father never blessed his choices, never said, I'm proud of you, never gave him permission to fully be himself. That grieving unlocked something. It created space between Robert and his father's legacy. It allowed Robert to see, my father's limitations are not my destiny. Step 2. Understand him as a wounded man, not a villain. This is crucial and often skipped. You cannot heal the father wound by demonizing your father. That just keeps you attached in negative form. You must see him as a human being who carried his own wounds, did the best he could with what he had, and passed on his unhealed trauma, not from malice, but from unconsciousness. Your father was once a son. He had a father who wounded him. He carried that forward. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it contextualizes it. It allows you to see him with compassion while still acknowledging the impact on you. Robert researched his grandfather's life, talked to relatives, learned about the violence, the alcoholism, the poverty, the trauma of that generation. He began to see his father not as someone who failed him, but as someone who survived tremendous trauma and did his best to not pass on the violence. His father's emotional absence was actually an attempt to be better than his father, even though it created its own wound. This understanding didn't erase Robert's pain, but it transformed it, from resentment to compassion, from blame to understanding, from attachment to freedom. Step 3. Separate his story from yours. This is where the real liberation happens. You must consciously choose which patterns are you repeating because they're actually yours, and which are you repeating because you inherited them. Which limitations are real and which are just your father's limitations that you've adopted as your own. Make a list. On one side, write your father's beliefs, patterns, wounds, limitations. On the other side, write what's actually true for you. The gap between those two columns is the space where your authentic self lives. Robert did this. His father believed success means modest stability. Ambition is dangerous. Education is impractical. Emotion is weakness. Work is suffering. Masculinity is silent endurance. Robert believed, once he separated his father's voice from his own. Success means full expression of potential. Ambition aligned with purpose is healthy. Education is transformative. Emotion is information. Work can be meaningful. Masculinity is wholeness, not performance. Once he saw the difference, he could choose. He didn't have to live by his father's beliefs. He could honor what his father gave him while releasing what no longer served. Step 4. Choose your own masculine identity. This is the ultimate step. Consciously defining what masculinity means for you, not as a reaction to your father, not as an adoption of his model, but as your own authentic expression. What does it mean for you to be a man? Not society's definition, not your father's definition, not the opposite of your father's definition, yours. For Robert, this meant completely redefining success, not as the opposite of his father's working-class life, the reaction he'd been living, and not as a repetition of it, but as something entirely his own. He realized he loved law, but he'd been practicing it for the wrong reasons, to prove something, to compensate for something, to heal something that wasn't his to heal. He left the corporate firm, started a small practice focused on work he actually cared about, made less money but felt more alive, reduced his hours so he could be emotionally present for his kids, breaking the absent father pattern not by overcompensating but by consciously choosing presence, started therapy to process emotion instead of suppressing it, healing the silence his father modeled. He didn't become his father. He didn't become the opposite of his father. He became himself. That's the resolution of the father wound, not fixing your father, not fixing yourself according to his standards, but liberating yourself from his story so you can write your own. Jung said it perfectly. The father is the representative of the spirit, of collective values. He must be surpassed for the individual to find his own way. Surpassed, not rejected, not worshipped, surpassed. You take what serves, release what doesn't, and move beyond into your own individuation. But here's the warning: the father wound is never completely healed. It's a lifelong process of separation and integration. You'll catch yourself repeating patterns decades later. You'll hear his voice in your head at unexpected moments. You'll realize you've been living out his unlived life in subtle ways you didn't recognize. This doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're human. It means the father wound is deep, archetypal, intergenerational. Healing it requires vigilance, consciousness, ongoing work. Robert told me something profound years into his healing process. I used to think my father's wound was about him failing me. Now I understand it was about him passing on the wound he received. And now I'm responsible for making sure I don't pass it forward. That's how the chain breaks, not by healing perfectly, but by becoming conscious enough that I don't unconsciously dump it on my kids. That's the real work. Not achieving perfect healing, but achieving enough consciousness that you don't traumatize the next generation the same way. Breaking the intergenerational cycle not through perfection, but through awareness. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. The men you judge as bad fathers are showing you aspects of your own father wound. The fathers you idealize are showing you what you wish your father had been. Your reactions to other men's parenting are maps to your own unhealed wounds. If you harshly judge absent fathers, you're feeling the pain of your father's absence. If you criticize critical fathers, you're hearing the voice of your internal critic. If you resent weak fathers, you're angry at what your father couldn't give you. If you hate domineering fathers, you're still fighting your father's control. Your judgment of other fathers is projection of your unprocessed father wound. And here's the ultimate truth about this wound. You cannot fully become yourself while you're still psychologically a son. You cannot individuate while you're still seeking father approval, father recognition, father blessing. You cannot express your authentic soul while you're carrying your father's unlived life. The work is essential. Difficult, painful, ongoing, but essential. Because underneath the father wound, underneath the patterns you inherited, underneath the trauma passed down through generations, there's you, your actual self, your authentic masculine identity that's not a reaction to anything, not a repetition of anything, not a compensation for anything, just you, as you truly are, as you were always meant to be. That self has been buried under generations of masculine conditioning, father wounds, intergenerational trauma. But it's there. It's been there all along, waiting for you to excavate it. The father wound is the fourth chain, and it's one of the deepest because it goes back before your conscious memory, before your sense of self, to the very formation of your masculine identity. But you can heal it. You can separate his story from yours. You can honor what he gave you while releasing what wounds you. You can become your own man, not by hating him, not by fixing him, not by proving anything to him, but by consciously choosing yourself. And when you do that work, when you finally liberate yourself from carrying dead men's trauma, you discover something shocking. The wound wasn't just from your father. It goes deeper, much deeper, because underneath the personal father wound lies something even more powerful, collective masculine conditioning stored in what Jung called the collective unconscious, archetypal patterns that have been shaping men for thousands of years, that you're carrying without even knowing it, that are possessing you from a level beneath personal psychology. You're not just living your father's unlived life. You're living in other men's nightmares, nightmares that stretch back through centuries of masculine conditioning. And that's where we're descending next. What if I told you that most of your beliefs about masculinity aren't yours? What if the shame you feel about vulnerability didn't come from your personal experience, but from thousands of years of men being killed for showing weakness? What if your compulsive need to achieve isn't about your individual psychology, but about ancestral masculine patterns where your worth equaled your utility and useless men died? What if you're not just carrying your wounds, you're carrying the wounds of every man who came before you? Let me tell you about Thomas. Thomas is 32. He grew up in a progressive household, emotionally available parents, no abuse, encouraged to express feelings, supported in whatever he wanted to pursue. By all accounts, he should be free from masculine conditioning. He should be able to be vulnerable, authentic, emotionally expressive. But Thomas can't shake a deep, inexplicable shame whenever he shows vulnerability. He can't explain where it comes from. His parents never shamed him for it. His partners have actively encouraged it. His friends are supportive. But the moment he starts to open up emotionally, something inside him recoils. A voice that isn't his conscious thought says, "This is dangerous. This will get you killed. This is weakness that cannot be tolerated." Where is that voice coming from? It's coming from the collective unconscious. It's coming from the accumulated experience of masculine conditioning stored in the deepest layers of the psyche. It's coming from thousands of generations of men who learned that vulnerability equals death, that emotion equals liability, that weakness gets you exiled from the tribe or killed on the battlefield. Thomas isn't carrying his father's conditioning. He's carrying every father's conditioning. He's carrying the archetypal masculine experience that Jung discovered exists beneath individual psychology. Jung's most revolutionary discovery was this: underneath your personal unconscious, your repressed memories, your shadow, your unprocessed trauma, lies a deeper layer called the collective unconscious. This is a shared, inherited psychic structure that contains the accumulated experiences, patterns, and archetypes of human history. Listen carefully to how Jung described it. The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution born anew in the brain structure of every individual. born anew in every individual. You're not starting fresh. You're not a blank slate. You're inheriting psychological patterns that have been developing for millennia. For men specifically, this means you're inheriting masculine conditioning that goes back to the beginning of human civilization. Patterns about what men must do, must be, must suppress, must perform to survive. And these patterns are operating in your psyche right now, influencing your behavior, shaping your beliefs, controlling you from a level you don't even know exists. Here's what most men don't understand. When you feel shame about crying, that shame isn't just yours. It's the shame of millions of men who were punished for emotional expression. When you feel compulsive pressure to achieve, that's not just your ambition. It's the ancestral pattern where men who didn't produce were cast out or killed. When you feel terror at the thought of being dominated by another man, that's not personal paranoia. It's the collective memory of hierarchical violence that shaped masculine psychology for thousands of years. You're living in other men's nightmares, and you don't even know it. Let me break down the primary archetypal patterns that are possessing modern men from the collective unconscious. The warrior without cause. For most of human history, men were warriors. Their survival, their tribe's survival, depended on their capacity for violence. This created an archetypal pattern: masculine aggression, the warrior energy, the capacity to fight and kill when necessary. But modern men don't have wars to fight. They don't have actual enemies threatening their tribe. The warrior archetype is still active in the psyche, but it has no appropriate outlet, so it expresses destructively through rage, through picking fights in relationships, through business domination, through road rage, through violence towards self or others. Thomas felt this. He had aggressive impulses that made no sense given his peaceful life. He'd find himself wanting to fight, to dominate, to prove physical superiority, not because he was personally traumatized, but because the warrior archetype was active in his unconscious, with nowhere to go. This is collective conditioning. The pattern of the warrior is archetypal. It lives in the collective unconscious of every man. But without conscious relationship to it, without appropriate channeling, it becomes destructive. The king without kingdom, another. Archetypal pattern: masculine authority, leadership, sovereignty. For most of history, men's identities were tied to their position in hierarchies, their ability to rule their domain, their authority over resources and people. Modern men inherit this pattern but have no kingdom. They're not kings of anything. They don't have clear domains of authority. They're employees, middle managers, suburbanites with mortgages. The king archetype is still active, but it has nowhere to reign. So it expresses as entitlement without responsibility, a sense of deserving authority without having earned it, resentment at being under anyone, inability to follow leadership, constant jockeying for status and position, fragile ego that needs constant recognition. Thomas experienced this too. He felt entitled to respect without having done anything to earn it. He resented his boss despite his boss being fair. He needed to be seen as important, special, above others, not because of personal narcissism, but because the king archetype was activated without any real kingdom to rule. The magician without ethics, the archetype of the wise man, the one who holds secret knowledge, who understands hidden things, who has power through wisdom. For most of history, this was the shaman, the priest, the elder who held spiritual knowledge. Modern men inherit this pattern, but in a broken form. Knowledge is commodified. Wisdom is reduced to information. Spiritual power is replaced by technical expertise or intellectual superiority. So the magician archetype expresses as using knowledge to manipulate rather than serve, intellectualizing emotions instead of feeling them, spiritual bypassing, feeling superior through knowing, hoarding information for power. Thomas did this constantly. He'd use psychological concepts to analyze others instead of connecting with them. He'd intellectualize his emotions instead of feeling them. He'd use spiritual language to maintain superiority. I'm more conscious than them. The magician archetype was active but distorted. The lover without heart. The archetype of connection, of eros, of relational intimacy, of masculine capacity for love and beauty and pleasure. In healthy form, this is deep intimacy, aesthetic appreciation, connection to the erotic as sacred. But in modern men, this archetype is usually corrupted. Love becomes possession. Eros becomes pornography. Intimacy becomes transaction. Connection becomes conquest. The lover archetype expresses as sexual compulsion without intimacy, using women for validation, confusing sex with connection, inability to be vulnerable in relationships, treating partners as objects to possess. Thomas struggled here too. He wanted connection but couldn't achieve it. His relationships felt hollow. Sex was disconnected from intimacy. He used romantic relationships to validate his ego rather than to actually connect. The lover archetype was active but wounded. These four, warrior, king, magician, lover, are what Jungian psychologist Robert Moore called the primary masculine archetypes. They're patterns that live in the collective unconscious of every man. When they're integrated consciously, they create wholeness. When they're unconscious, they create pathology. But here's what's crucial. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're living psychological forces that are influencing your behavior right now. You're being possessed by archetypal patterns you've never examined. Jung warned about this explicitly. When an archetype is constellated, it possesses the individual. He is then unable to distinguish himself from it. Possessed. You're being possessed by collective patterns, ancient masculine conditioning, archetypal forces that are not you, but feel like you because they're operating from beneath consciousness. Thomas realized this when his therapist asked him, "Where did you learn that vulnerability is dangerous? Can you point to a specific experience?" He couldn't. There was no traumatic event, no moment of punishment for showing emotion. But the belief was there anyway, powerful and absolute, because it wasn't his personal belief. It was a collective belief, stored in the archetypal masculine patterns he'd inherited. This is what makes collective conditioning so insidious. It feels like your truth. It feels like your personality. It feels like who you are. But it's not. It's the accumulated conditioning of thousands of generations of men, passed down through the collective unconscious, activated in your psyche, controlling your behavior. So how do you free yourself from patterns that aren't even consciously yours? The archetypal consciousness practice. Step 1. Recognize when you're possessed. You need to learn to distinguish between your authentic self and archetypal possession. Here's how. When a reaction feels disproportionate to the situation, when a belief feels absolute despite having no personal basis, when a behavior pattern feels compulsive and you don't know why, you're likely dealing with archetypal possession. Thomas started noticing. The shame about vulnerability wasn't proportional to his actual experience. That was archetypal. The need to dominate despite having no real threats, that was archetypal. The entitlement to authority without earning it. Archetypal. The intellectual superiority as defense. Archetypal. Once he could name it, he could separate from it. This isn't me. This is the warrior pattern. This is the king's shadow. This is collective conditioning operating through me. Step 2. Trace the pattern to its collective source. Instead of looking for personal causes, look for archetypal origins. Where did this pattern come from in the collective masculine experience? The shame about vulnerability. Thousands of years of men being killed or exiled for showing weakness. The pressure to achieve. Centuries of male worth being tied to utility and provision. The terror of domination. generations of violent hierarchical control, the emotional shutdown, ancestral patterns where emotion was liability in survival situations. Understanding the collective source doesn't excuse the behavior, but it contextualizes it. It allows you to see, this pattern made sense for survival in ancestral environments, but I'm not in that environment. This pattern is outdated programming running in my psyche. Step 3. Consciously choose your relationship to the archetype. You can't eliminate archetypal patterns. They're part of the collective unconscious, but you can become conscious of them. You can choose how to relate to them, how to express them, whether to let them possess you or work with them deliberately. Thomas started doing this. He recognized the warrior archetype wasn't bad. It was essential masculine energy, but he needed to channel it consciously. So he started martial arts training, giving the warrior energy appropriate outlet. He used the warrior's discipline and focus for his work, but didn't let it possess him into aggression. He recognized the king archetype's value, the capacity to lead, to create order, to take responsibility. But he separated that from entitlement. He practiced sovereignty over his own life, leadership in his actual domains, without needing to dominate others or demand recognition. He integrated the magician consciously, using knowledge to serve rather than manipulate, sharing wisdom rather than hoarding it, maintaining healthy boundaries without superiority. He healed the lover, learning to connect intimately without possession, to express eros without corruption, to love without objectifying. This is conscious archetypal relationship, not being possessed by the patterns, but working with them deliberately. Step 4. Distinguish personal from collective. This is the ultimate practice, learning to distinguish what's actually yours versus what's collective conditioning running through you. Ask yourself consistently, is this belief mine or is it something every man is taught? Is this fear from my experience or is it ancestral conditioning? Is this desire authentic or is it me acting out collective masculine patterns? The more you ask this question, the more you can separate. The more you separate, the more you can choose. The more you choose, the more you become yourself instead of a vessel for collective conditioning. Thomas discovered that about 70% of what he thought was his personality was actually collective masculine conditioning. The stoicism, collective. The need to appear strong, collective. The suppression of tenderness, collective. The definition of success, collective. The relationship to competition, collective. Once he saw that, he could ask, what's actually mine? What do I actually want, believe, value when I'm not performing collective masculinity? The answers surprised him. He actually valued tenderness over toughness. He actually wanted collaboration over competition. He actually found meaning in connection rather than achievement. He actually preferred emotional depth to stoic performance. But he'd been suppressing all of that because collective conditioning told him real men don't value those things. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. The masculine behaviors you judge most harshly in other men, the toxic patterns, the unconscious behaviors, the destructive expressions, those are showing you the collective patterns you're still carrying unconsciously. When you judge toxic masculinity in others, look for the subtle ways you're still expressing those same patterns. The aggression you condemn in them might be the passive aggression in you. The emotional shutdown you criticize might be your own intellectualization. The domination you hate might be your subtle control. The entitlement you despise might be your hidden superiority. You're recognizing collective patterns in others because you're carrying them yourself, just in more socially acceptable forms. Jung put it powerfully. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. When you don't recognize the collective patterns operating within you, You'll experience them as external, as other men's toxic behavior, as society's oppression, as masculine culture's problems. But those external manifestations are mirrors. They're showing you what's unconscious in yourself. Thomas had a breakthrough when he realized every toxic masculine behavior he judged in other men, he was doing in subtle ways. He'd judge aggressive men while being passive-aggressive. He'd criticize emotionally shut-down men while intellectualizing his own emotions. He'd hate entitled men while feeling subtle superiority. He'd condemn men who dominated women while subtly manipulating in his relationships. He wasn't better than them. He was expressing the same collective patterns in more sophisticated, socially acceptable ways. He'd just hidden them better, justified them better, spiritual bypassed them better. That recognition was humbling and necessary, because you cannot free yourself from collective conditioning while believing you're above it. The moment you think you've transcended these patterns is usually the moment they have you most thoroughly. Jung warned about this. The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. Not only dark, but also light, not only bestial, semi-human, and demonic, but superhuman, spiritual, and in the classical sense of the word, divine. The collective unconscious contains both, the toxic patterns and the healing archetypes, the wounds and the wisdom, the conditioning and the potential for liberation. You're not trying to escape the collective unconscious. You're trying to become conscious of it so you can work with it deliberately instead of being possessed by it. Thomas began this work seriously. Every time he caught himself in a masculine pattern, stoicism, aggression, competition, emotional suppression, entitlement, he'd pause and ask, is this me or is this collective conditioning? Is this my authentic choice or am I being possessed by ancestral patterns? Sometimes the answer was, this is collective and I choose to release it. The shame about vulnerability? Released. The belief that worth equals achievement? Released. The terror of being seen as weak? Released. But sometimes the answer was, this is collective and I choose to integrate it consciously. The warrior energy, channeled into discipline and protection. The king energy, expressed as responsibility and leadership. The magician energy, used for wisdom and service. The lover energy, embodied as intimacy and connection. The practice wasn't about rejecting all collective patterns. It was about becoming conscious of them so he could choose which to express and how to express them. And something profound happened. As Thomas became more conscious of collective conditioning, he became more himself. The authentic self that had been buried under layers of ancestral programming began to emerge. He discovered desires that were actually his, values that weren't performed, behaviors that came from authentic choice rather than unconscious possession. He started crying when he needed to cry, not because he forced it, but because the collective prohibition against masculine tears lost its power. He started pursuing creative work that didn't make sense by traditional masculine standards, because he was no longer possessed by the collective belief that men must be practical and productive above all else. He started forming friendships based on intimacy rather than competition, because the ancestral pattern of hierarchical masculine relationships no longer controlled him. He became freer, more alive, more himself. But here's the warning. This work never ends. You'll keep discovering new layers of collective conditioning. You'll catch yourself being possessed by archetypal patterns years into the work. You'll realize beliefs you thought were yours are actually collective programming. This isn't failure. This is the nature of consciousness. You're not trying to achieve perfect freedom from the collective unconscious. You're trying to maintain ongoing awareness of its influence. Thomas told me something years into his practice. I used to think becoming conscious meant escaping all conditioning. Now I understand it means recognizing conditioning as it arises, choosing my relationship to it, and expressing what's authentically mine. I'm still influenced by collective patterns, but I'm no longer possessed by them. That's the difference between slavery and freedom. That's the resolution of collective conditioning. Not transcendence, but consciousness. Not escape, but choice. Not rejection of all collective patterns, but discernment between what serves and what imprisons. The collective unconscious is the fifth chain, and it's perhaps the most invisible because the conditioning is so deep, so ancient, so pervasive that it feels like natural truth rather than inherited programming. But it's not natural truth, it's conditioning, and once you see it, once you recognize how much of what you thought was, you is actually thousands of years of masculine programming, you can finally start to choose. You can finally ask, who am I when I'm not performing collective masculinity? What do I actually want when I'm not chasing inherited patterns? What does it mean for me to be a man when I define it myself instead of accepting ancestral definitions? Those questions lead to liberation, but answering them requires something most men are terrified to do. It requires descending into the darkness, experiencing psychological death, letting go of the identity you've been performing, and trusting that something new will emerge on the other side. It requires the journey that every hero must eventually take, but that most men spend their entire lives avoiding. It requires facing your fear of the descent. And that's where we're going next. There's a truth that spiritual teachers, therapists, and wise elders all know but rarely speak directly. You cannot evolve into your authentic self without first dying to who you've been. Not metaphorical death, not abstract transformation, actual psychological death, the dissolution of your identity, the collapse of your carefully constructed self, the experience of annihilation that precedes rebirth, and you're terrified of it. Let me tell you about Stephen. Stephen is 45. Successful architect, 20-year marriage, 2 teenage kids. Good life by every external measure, but for the past 3 years, he's been having the same dream. He's standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind him is his life, his house, his family, his career, everything familiar. In front of him is darkness, complete darkness, no ground visible, no certainty, no guarantee of anything. And in the dream, he knows he's supposed to jump. He knows his evolution depends on it, but he can't. He stands there paralyzed night after night, unable to jump, unable to turn back, frozen between the life he's outgrown and the transformation he's terrified to enter. That dream is his psyche screaming at him. It's time to descend. It's time to die to who you've been. It's time to let go. And Stephen, like most men, is doing everything possible to avoid it. This is what Jung called the night sea journey, the necessary descent into darkness that precedes psychological rebirth. Every mythology, every spiritual tradition, every hero's journey includes this phase, the descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the death that precedes resurrection. Jung explained it clearly. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Making the darkness conscious. Not avoiding it, not transcending it, not spiritual bypassing it, descending into it, sitting with it, dying into it. But modern culture, especially masculine culture, has taught you to avoid this descent at all costs. You're taught to stay positive, focus on growth, overcome obstacles, never give up, keep moving forward. The entire self-improvement industrial complex is built on the lie that transformation is about addition, adding better habits, better mindsets, better strategies. But real transformation isn't addition. It's subtraction, it's death, it's the dissolution of the false self so the authentic self can emerge. And that descent, that death, it's exactly what you've been running from your entire life. Here's why men fear the descent so intensely: fear of losing control. Masculine identity and patriarchal culture is built on control. Control of emotion, control of circumstances, control of outcomes. The descent requires complete surrender of control. You don't control when it happens, how it unfolds, or what emerges on the other side. For men who've built their entire identity on being in control, this feels like annihilation. Stephen felt this acutely. He'd built a life of meticulous control, every detail planned, every risk calculated, every outcome managed. The descent was asking him to release all of that, to free fall into uncertainty, to trust a process he couldn't control. His ego recoiled in terror, fear of vulnerability. The descent requires complete vulnerability. You can't descend with your armor on, your persona intact, your defenses operational. You have to go naked into the darkness. For men who've been taught that vulnerability equals death, this feels like voluntary suicide, fear of uncertainty. The descent doesn't come with a roadmap. You don't know how long it will last. You don't know what you'll encounter. You don't know who you'll be on the other side. For men who need to know the plan, who need guarantees, who need certainty before taking action, this is paralyzing. Stephen kept asking his therapist, "But what if I jump and there's nothing there? What if I let go of my identity and nothing new emerges? What if I descend and just stay down there?" His therapist's response was the only honest answer. That's the risk. That's why it's called faith. That's why it requires courage you've never needed before. Fear of temporary dissolution. During the descent, you will experience periods where you have no idea who you are. Your old identity is dead, but the new one hasn't fully formed. You're in the void, the liminal space, the darkness between identities. This is psychologically terrifying. Your ego, whose job is to maintain coherent identity, experiences this as existential threat, fear of what you'll find. The descent takes you into your shadow, your wounds, your rejected parts, your unprocessed trauma. You will encounter aspects of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. For men who've built elaborate defenses against self-knowledge, the prospect of seeing themselves fully is more frightening than physical death. These fears are legitimate. The descent is dangerous, not physically, but psychologically. You will lose your old identity. You will experience periods of not knowing who you are. You will face your shadow. You will sit with terror and grief and rage that you've been suppressing. You will question everything you thought was true about yourself. Jung didn't sugarcoat this. The encounter with the unconscious is dangerous. People say it is not, but they do not know what they are talking about. The descent to the underworld always involves serious risk. Serious risk. But here's what he also said. The descent is necessary for transformation. There is no becoming who you truly are without first experiencing the death of who you thought you were. Stephen stood at that cliff edge for 3 years before he finally jumped. And he only jumped because the pain of staying became greater than the fear of descending. His marriage was dying because he couldn't show up authentically. His kids were becoming strangers because he couldn't be real with them. His work felt meaningless because he was performing rather than creating. The old identity was becoming a prison, and the pain of maintaining it finally exceeded his fear of letting it die. So he jumped. Here's what the descent actually looks like. It's not one moment of heroic leap. It's a process with distinct stages, and understanding these stages can help you navigate them when your time comes. The 5 stages of psychological death. Stage 1, the comfortable prison. This is where Stephen started, where most men live their entire lives. The old identity feels safe, even if it's limiting. You know who you are, even if that identity is false. Your life is predictable, even if it's deadening. There's a comfort in the known, even when the known is a prison. At this stage, you're aware something is wrong, but not uncomfortable enough to change. Stage 2, the call to descent. Something breaks through the comfort, a crisis, a loss, a moment of clarity, a dream that won't stop recurring, a persistent sense that your life isn't actually yours. Jung called this the call to adventure in hero's journey terms, but it's really a call to psychological death. Your soul is demanding evolution, and evolution requires the old self to die. At this stage, you can still refuse the call, and most men do, returning to the comfortable prison, suppressing the call, distracting themselves. Stephen received this call through his recurring dream and through his body, panic attacks, insomnia, a sense of dread he couldn't shake. His psyche was screaming, "It's time." Stage 3, resistance. You hear the call, but you fight it. You try every possible way to evolve without actually descending. You read books. You try new habits. You make surface-level changes. You go to therapy but avoid the deep work. You spiritual bypass, using meditation and positive thinking to avoid the darkness. You tell yourself you can transform through addition rather than death. This stage can last years, decades even. You're circling the cliff edge, looking for another way down, hoping to find stairs instead of the free fall. Stephen tried everything. New hobbies, marriage counseling that stayed surface level, career changes that didn't address the core issue, meditation practice that became another form of control. He was trying to evolve without dying, to transform without descending. It doesn't work. It never works. Stage 4, surrender. Finally, you can't avoid it anymore. Either the pain of staying exceeds the fear of descending, or you're pushed by circumstances beyond your control, or you finally accept that there's no other way. You surrender. You step off the cliff. You allow the dissolution. You stop fighting the death and let it happen. This is the moment of true courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to proceed despite terror. Stephen's surrender happened during a panic attack so severe he thought he was dying physically. In that moment, he stopped fighting. He stopped trying to control. He let go completely. And that letting go was the beginning of his descent. Stage 5, the dark night. This is the heart of the descent. You're in the darkness now. Your old identity is dead or dying. The new one hasn't emerged. You don't know who you are. Nothing makes sense. Your old values feel empty. Your old goals feel meaningless. Your old persona can't be maintained. You're in the void, the liminal space, the death phase. This is the hardest part. This is where most people panic and try to reconstruct the old identity, to climb back up, to abort the process. But if you can stay here, if you can sit in the darkness without grasping for the familiar, if you can be with the not knowing, something miraculous begins to happen. Stephen spent 6 months in this stage. He called it the unraveling. He couldn't maintain his architect persona. He couldn't perform as husband and father. He couldn't pretend to have answers. He sat with profound uncertainty, deep grief, existential terror. He let his old self die without knowing what would replace it. And it was the most difficult thing he'd ever done. But he stayed. He didn't run. He didn't rebuild the old identity. He sat in the darkness and trusted, not that everything would be okay, but that the process itself had intelligence, that death is necessary for rebirth, that his soul knew what it was doing even if his ego was terrified. And then slowly, something new began to emerge. Not the old Stephen with some improvements, not a slightly better version of the character he'd been performing. Something genuinely new, an authentic self that had been buried under 45 years of persona, conditioning, wounds, and performance. This isn't the final stage. There's no final stage, because individuation is a lifelong process. But its emergence from the dark night, its psychological rebirth, it's the new self that can only come after the old self dies. Stephen described it as meeting myself for the first time. The new self that emerged wasn't who he thought he'd be. It wasn't who he'd been trying to become. It was something he never could have planned or predicted. More tender than he'd allowed himself to be. More creative than his rational mind permitted. More uncertain yet more grounded. Less in control but more authentic. Simpler but deeper. He left architecture not in rebellion but because it wasn't actually his calling. He'd chosen it to please his father, to prove his worth, to have a prestigious identity. The descent burned away those false motivations, and what remained was his actual soul's desire, teaching. He became a high school art teacher, making a fraction of his former income, but feeling alive for the first time in decades. His marriage transformed because he could finally show up as himself, rather than as the good husband persona. His kids got to meet their actual father instead of the performed version. His relationships deepened because he was no longer maintaining facades. Did the descent solve all his problems? No. Did it make life easier? Not necessarily. Did it make him happier in a conventional sense? Not always. But it made him real. It made him whole. It made him himself. That's what the descent offers. Not happiness, not success, not comfort, but authenticity. The chance to finally be who you actually are instead of who you've been performing. Jung promised this: the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. The ego, the constructed identity, the persona, the false self, must die for the true self to emerge. There's no way around this. Every spiritual tradition knows it. Every mythology encodes it. Every wise elder has lived it. But modern culture has forgotten it. We're taught that transformation is about becoming a better version of yourself. But that's not transformation, that's improvement. Transformation is becoming a different self entirely, and that requires the death of the old one. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. The people you judge for falling apart or having a crisis or losing themselves are often the ones doing the real work of transformation. They're descending. They're dying to their old self. They're in the dark night. And you're judging them because you're terrified of your own necessary descent. The midlife crisis you mock. That's often the psyche demanding transformation. The spiritual seeker who seems lost. They might be in the void between identities. The person who quit their successful career for something that doesn't make sense. They might have emerged from their descent into authentic purpose. Your judgment reveals your fear. What you criticize in others' transformation journeys is often what you're avoiding in your own. Stephen had judged people like this before his descent. He'd seen friends go through crises and thought they were being irresponsible, weak, self-indulgent. Now he understood. They were being brave. They were answering the call he'd been refusing. They were willing to die to the old self while he was still clinging to the comfortable prison. That recognition was humbling and necessary. So here's what I need you to understand. If you're at the cliff edge right now, if you're hearing the call to descend, if something in you is dying and you're terrified, you're not broken, you're not having a crisis, you're being invited into transformation. The fear is legitimate, the stakes are real, the risk is genuine, but the alternative, spending the rest of your life in the comfortable prison, maintaining a false identity, never knowing who you actually are, that's the real tragedy. Jung said it perfectly. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But to claim that privilege, you must first die to who you're not. You must descend into the darkness. You must surrender control. You must sit in the void. You must trust the process of dissolution and rebirth. There's no other way. The fear of the descent is the sixth chain, and it's perhaps the most powerful because it keeps you locked in all the other chains. As long as you're avoiding necessary death, you can't fully break free from persona, shadow, conditioning, wounds. As long as you're refusing the descent, you're maintaining the false self. But when you finally jump, when you finally surrender to the death that's been calling you, when you finally trust the darkness, everything changes. Not immediately, not easily, not without pain, but real. But when you finally jump, when you finally surrender to the death that's been calling you, when you finally trust the darkness, everything changes. Not immediately, not easily, not without pain, but really, deeply, authentically. You become who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be. And that's worth every moment of terror, every second of uncertainty, every experience of dissolution. Because on the other side of that, death is life. Real life. Your life. But even after the descent, even after you've died to the false self and begun to emerge into authenticity, there's still something that can trap you. Something that can keep you from fully embodying who you've become. It's the disconnection from the compass that's been trying to guide you all along. The loss of relationship with the deepest organizing principle of your psyche. The severance from what Jung called the self. And that's where we're going next. What if I told you that beneath your conscious identity, beneath your ego, beneath everything you think of as you, there's something deeper, something wiser, something that knows who you truly are and where you need to go. Something that's been trying to guide you your entire life, but you've lost the ability to hear it. Jung called this the self, capital S, and it's not a metaphor. It's not a philosophical abstraction. It's a living, organizing principle at the center of your psyche. It's your inner compass, your soul's wisdom, your connection to something greater than ego consciousness, and you've lost touch with it completely. Let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel is 34, MBA from a top school, rising through the corporate ranks faster than anyone his age. By every external metric, he's crushing it. Promotions, salary increases, respect from colleagues. He should feel successful. He should feel on track. But Daniel wakes up every morning with a sense of profound wrongness. He can't explain. Like he's living someone else's life. Like every decision he makes is taking him further from something essential, but he can't name what. Like he's achieved everything he's supposed to want, and yet he's never felt more lost. He came to therapy asking, "Why do I feel so empty when my life looks so good?" The answer? He's disconnected from his self. He's built an entire life based on ego needs, social conditioning, external validation. But he's lost touch with the deeper organizing principle that actually knows what he needs. Jung made a crucial distinction that most people completely miss. He separated ego from self, and understanding this distinction changes everything. The ego is your conscious identity. It's your sense of I. It's your personality, your beliefs, your self-image, your rational mind. The ego is necessary. You need it to function in the world. But the ego is not who you truly are. It's just the conscious tip of your psychological iceberg. Beneath the ego, at the center of the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious, is the self. Jung described it this way. The self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality. The self is your true nature. It's the organizing wisdom that's been trying to individuate you your entire life. It's the voice that whispers when you're off track. It's the dreams that guide you toward wholeness. It's the inexplicable knowing that certain paths are yours and others aren't. It's your soul's intelligence. And here's what's tragic. Most men live their entire lives identified with ego, while completely disconnected from self. They make decisions based on what ego wants, approval, success, security, validation, while ignoring what self knows. They chase ego goals while their soul slowly dies. Daniel was the perfect example. Every major decision in his life had been made by ego, college choice, based on prestige, ego, need for status, career path based on salary and advancement potential, ego, need for security and recognition, relationships based on what looked good, ego, need for social approval, life goals, all externally defined, ego, need for validation. Not once had he asked, what does my deeper self actually want? What is my soul calling me toward? What does the organizing wisdom of my psyche know that my conscious mind doesn't? And that disconnection was killing him from the inside. Here's how you know if you're disconnected from self. You make decisions from fear instead of inner knowing. When faced with choices, your primary drivers are, what will keep me safe? What will people approve of? What makes logical sense? What's the smart move? But you never ask, what does my soul want? What feels deeply right, even if I can't rationally explain it? What is my inner compass pointing toward? Daniel made every decision from fear, fear of falling behind, fear of disappointing people, fear of making the wrong choice. His entire life was organized around risk mitigation, not soul alignment. External validation defines your worth. Your sense of okayness depends on achievements, recognition, approval from others. When you succeed externally, you feel briefly good. When you fail or aren't recognized, you feel worthless. You're completely dependent on external feedback because you've lost access to the internal knowing of the self that says, you're whole, regardless of external circumstances. Daniel's entire self-worth was tied to his performance metrics. A good quarter and he felt valuable, a setback and he felt like a failure. He had no internal ground, no connection to a worth that exists independent of achievement. You can't sit in silence without distraction. When you're alone with yourself, without phone, without work, without entertainment, you feel anxious, uncomfortable, desperate to fill the space. That's because in the silence you might hear the self. You might feel the disconnect between ego's life and soul's desire. So you avoid silence at all costs. Daniel couldn't be alone with his thoughts for more than a few minutes before reaching for his phone, turning on a podcast, checking email, anything to avoid the discomfort of facing himself without distraction. You feel no sense of being guided. Life feels random. Choices feel arbitrary. You're navigating purely by logic, external advice, social conditioning. You have no sense of being guided by something deeper, of being part of a larger unfolding, of your life having an intelligence beyond your conscious planning. Daniel felt like he was making it all up as he went along, following a generic success template, hoping it would somehow lead to fulfillment. He had no sense of his life having purpose or direction beyond what he consciously manufactured. This is what disconnection from self creates. A life that looks successful but feels empty. Achievement without meaning, recognition without fulfillment, constant activity without any sense of being on your actual path. Jung warned about this explicitly. The ego stands to the self as the move to the mover, or as object to subject, because the determining factors, which radiate out from the self, surround the ego on all sides and are therefore superordinate to it. The self is supposed to guide the ego. The deeper wisdom is supposed to inform conscious choices. But modern life, especially masculine conditioning, has inverted this relationship. Ego thinks it's in charge. Ego makes all the decisions. Ego ignores or suppresses signals from the self. And the result is a life that's successful by ego standards, but devastating by soul standards. Daniel's turning point came during a business trip. He was in a hotel room late at night, jet-lagged and unable to sleep. In that vulnerable state, his defenses down, something broke through. Not a voice exactly, but a knowing, a sense that every choice he'd made for the past 10 years had taken him further from himself, that the life he was building was impressive, but wrong, that he needed to stop, listen, and let something deeper guide him. That was his self breaking through the ego's control. That was the compass he'd been ignoring finally getting his attention. The problem for most men is they have no practice in accessing the self. They've been trained to trust only rational mind, only ego consciousness, only external information. The idea of inner guidance, of soul wisdom, of self-knowledge. It sounds mystical, unreliable, potentially delusional. But Jung was clear. The self is real. It's always guiding you, and learning to hear it is essential for individuation. So how do you reconnect? How do you restore the ego-self axis, the relationship between conscious identity and deeper wisdom? The self-connection practices. Practice 1. Active imagination. This is Jung's primary technique for connecting with the unconscious, with the self. You enter a meditative state and allow images, figures, or scenes to emerge spontaneously from the unconscious. Then you engage with them consciously, asking questions, receiving guidance, dialoguing with aspects of your psyche that are deeper than ego. Daniel started this practice hesitantly. He'd sit in silence and ask internally, "What does my deeper self want me to know?" At first, nothing. Then, slowly, images began to emerge. A path through a forest, a door he was afraid to open, a child version of himself, crying. These weren't conscious thoughts. They were messages from the self, showing him what needed attention, what he'd been avoiding, where he needed to go. Practice 2. Dream work. Dreams are the self's primary language. Every night your psyche is trying to communicate with you, to show you what's unconscious, to guide you toward wholeness. But most men ignore dreams completely or only pay attention to weird ones without trying to understand their meaning. Daniel began recording his dreams. At first they seemed random, but patterns emerged. Dreams of missing flights, of being in the wrong place, of forgetting something important. His self was showing him, "You're on the wrong path. You're missing your true calling. You've forgotten what actually matters." As he paid attention, the dreams became clearer. They started showing him what he actually longed for, teaching, mentoring, working with young people. His conscious ego had dismissed this as impractical, but his self kept showing it to him in dreams because it was his actual calling. Practice 3. Body wisdom. The self speaks through the body as much as through dreams and imagination. Physical sensations, gut feelings, heart knowings, these are the self's guidance. But masculine conditioning teaches men to ignore body wisdom, to live purely in the head, to trust only rational thought. Daniel started paying attention to his body's signals. When he was in corporate meetings, his body contracted, tight chest, shallow breathing, tension. When he spent time with his nephew, helping with homework, his body opened, ease, flow, energy. His body was telling him what his mind was ignoring. This path drains you, that path feeds you. Practice 4. Solitude in nature. The self is easier to access, away from civilization's noise. Nature has a way of quieting ego chatter and allowing deeper wisdom to emerge. This is why every spiritual tradition involves wilderness time, why vision quests happen in nature, why Jung himself retreated to his tower regularly. Daniel started taking solo camping trips. No phone, no agenda, just time alone in wild places. In that solitude, without the constant input of civilization, he could finally hear the quiet voice of his self. It wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, persistent, clear. This corporate path is not yours. Your soul wants to teach, to guide, to work with youth. The money, the status, the success. Ego wants those. Your self wants something else. Practice 5. Creative expression without purpose. The self expresses through creativity, but not goal-oriented creativity. True self-expression comes through art, music, writing, movement done purely for its own sake, not for product or approval. When you create without ego agenda, the self can speak through you. Daniel started drawing, something he'd loved as a kid, but abandoned as impractical. He didn't try to be good. He didn't show anyone. He just drew. And in that creative space, truths emerged, images of paths not taken, symbols of what he longed for. The self was communicating through his hands what his mind had been suppressing. These practices aren't about adding new achievements or improving yourself. They're about creating space for the self to be heard. They're about restoring the relationship between ego and the deeper organizing wisdom of your psyche. And here's what Daniel discovered. The self's guidance is different from ego's desires. Ego wants success, recognition, security, comfort. The self wants wholeness, authenticity, meaning, soul alignment. Sometimes these overlap. Often they don't. The ego-self axis doesn't mean the self always overrules the ego. It means they're in conversation. The ego brings practical concerns, reality testing, conscious planning. The self brings deeper wisdom, soul knowledge, intuitive guidance. When they're connected, you make decisions that satisfy both, practical and meaningful, successful and authentic, rational and intuitive. But when they're disconnected, you end up like Daniel, achieving ego goals while your soul slowly dies. Jung put it powerfully. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. And the meeting of ego with self is the most important contact of all, for it transforms the entire personality. The ego-self relationship transforms you. It's not about ego becoming perfect or self being consistently accessible. It's about ongoing dialogue, continuous connection, lived relationship between your conscious identity and your deeper organizing wisdom. Daniel made changes based on this reconnection. Not impulsive ego reaction changes, but changes that came from deep self-knowing. He left corporate work, not in rebellion, but because his self made it clear this path was killing him. He went back to school to become a high school counselor. His ego protested the pay cut, the loss of status, the judgment from colleagues. But his self knew, this is your path. 3 years into his new career, Daniel told me, I make a third of what I used to make. My old colleagues think I had a breakdown. My resume looks like I went backward, but I wake up every morning feeling like I'm finally living my life instead of performing someone else's. That's not ego talking. Ego still wants the success, the money, the recognition. That's myself, finally being expressed instead of suppressed. That's what self-connection creates. Alignment between your life and your actual soul. Not perfection, not constant happiness, not absence of struggle, but a sense that you're on your path, expressing your purpose, living your truth. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. The people you judge as lost or searching or not having their life together might actually be more connected to their self than you are to yours. They might be following soul guidance that doesn't make ego sense. They might be prioritizing meaning over success, authenticity over approval, self-alignment over social conditioning. Your judgment of them reveals your own disconnection. What you criticize in their journey is often what you're afraid to acknowledge in yourself. That maybe your successful life is disconnected from your actual self. That maybe you've been following ego while ignoring soul. Daniel used to judge friends who left prestigious careers for lesser work. He thought they were failures, cop-outs, people who couldn't hack it. Now he understood. They were likely following their self while he was still trapped in ego. They were brave enough to prioritize soul alignment over social approval. They were more connected to their compass than he was. That recognition was both humbling and liberating. So here's what I need you to understand. Your life might look successful. Your achievements might be impressive. Your choices might be logical. But if you're disconnected from yourself, you're living a ghost's life. You're achieving ego goals while your soul starves. The reconnection is possible. The practices work. The self is always there, always guiding, always trying to individuate you toward wholeness. But you have to create space to hear it. You have to value its guidance above ego's demands. You have to be willing to follow your compass, even when it points away from conventional success. Jung promised, "The self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality." Your self is trying to guide you toward your actual individuation, your real purpose, your authentic expression. But you can't receive that guidance if you're living purely from ego, if you're making all decisions from fear or conditioning or external validation. The disconnection from self is the seventh chain, and for many men it's the most tragic, because you can break all the other chains, integrate shadow, heal wounds, drop persona, and still end up living a life that's not actually yours if you're disconnected from yourself. But when you reconnect, when you restore the ego-self axis, when you start making decisions in dialogue with your deeper wisdom, everything changes. Not externally necessarily, but internally, absolutely. You feel guided, you sense purpose, you experience alignment. You know you're on your path. That knowing is what you've been searching for all along. Not in achievements, not in approval, not in success. In the deep, quiet certainty that comes from living in alignment with your actual self. But here's the final trap, the one that catches even men who've done all this work, who've integrated their shadow and healed their wounds and connected with their self. It's the trap that keeps you performing even after you've seen through the performance. It's the addiction that masquerades as purpose. It's the hero trap. And that's where we're going next. The hero's journey you've been sold is killing you, not because the journey itself is wrong, but because you've been told it never ends. You've been taught that your value comes from conquering, achieving, building, winning. That masculinity means constant forward motion, relentless progress, never resting, always climbing. You've been sold the lie that the hero's journey is the entire journey, and now you're trapped in heroic identity, unable to evolve beyond it, addicted to achievement, confusing conquest with consciousness. Let me tell you about Michael. Michael is 49, self-made millionaire, built 3 successful companies, best-selling author, respected thought leader, mentor to dozens of entrepreneurs. By every measure, Michael is a hero in the traditional sense. He's conquered challenges, built empires, achieved at the highest level. But Michael can't stop. Even when he wants to, even when his body is screaming for rest, even when his relationships are collapsing because he's never present, he can't stop achieving. He's built 7 companies when 3 would have been enough. He's written 5 books when 1 would have said everything. He's mentoring so many people he has no time for his own inner life. Michael came to therapy because his wife gave him an ultimatum. Stop performing the hero or I'm leaving. I didn't marry an achievement machine. I married a human being and I haven't seen him in years. That confrontation shattered Michael's identity, because if he wasn't the hero, constantly conquering and building and achieving, who was he? This is the hero trap, and it's the final chain keeping men from their authentic souls. Jung made a crucial distinction that most people completely miss. The hero archetype is necessary and valuable for the first half of life. It's how ego develops, how you separate from family, how you establish yourself in the world, how you build competence and confidence. The hero's journey, facing challenges, overcoming obstacles, conquering fears, achieving goals, this is essential for psychological maturation. But Jung was also clear, if you stay identified with the hero archetype into the second half of life, it becomes pathological. What was once developmental becomes destructive. The hero who doesn't evolve beyond heroism becomes a caricature, a performance, an addiction. Listen to how Jung put it. The hero's main feat is to overcome the monster of darkness. It is the long-hoped-for and expected triumph of consciousness over the unconscious. But then he says something most people never hear. But this is only the first stage. The second half of life requires something different, not conquest of the unconscious, but cooperation with it, not heroic achievement, but integration. The second half of life requires post-heroic consciousness. It requires moving from doing to being, from achieving to actualizing, from proving to expressing, from independence to interdependence. But masculine culture doesn't teach this. Culture tells you the hero phase never ends, that you should always be striving, always growing, always achieving more. The self-improvement industrial complex, success culture, entrepreneurial mythology, all of it reinforces heroic identity as the pinnacle of masculine development. And men like Michael get trapped, addicted to achievement, unable to rest because rest feels like death, defining themselves entirely through conquest because they have no idea who they are without it. Here's how you know if you're in the hero trap. Compulsive achievement. You can't stop achieving even when you've achieved enough. Each success just moves the goalposts further. You finish one goal and immediately need the next one. Rest doesn't feel like rest. It feels like stagnation, falling behind, wasting time. You're not achieving because you want to anymore. You're achieving because you don't know how to stop. Michael built his seventh company not because he needed another business, but because stopping felt like dying. The achievement was the identity. Without conquest, who was he? Inability to be present. Your mind is always on the next goal, the next challenge, the next mountain to climb. You're physically with your family, but mentally planning your next move. You can't enjoy success because you're already fixated on what's next. Present moment experience feels empty because it's not about forward progress. Michael's wife said, "We'll be on vacation and you're on your phone building the next thing. We'll be at dinner and you're mentally in tomorrow's meeting. You're never here. You're always conquering something that isn't even in front of you." Self-worth tied to external conquest. Your sense of being okay depends entirely on whether you're achieving. A day without measurable progress feels like a failed day. You judge yourself by your output, your results, your accomplishments. You have no sense of inherent worth independent of achievement. Michael measured his worth by quarterly metrics. Good quarter, he had value. Setback, he was failing. His entire self-esteem was tied to external markers of success. He had no ground beneath the achievement, no sense that he mattered simply for existing. Fear of the ordinary. You're terrified of being average, normal, unremarkable. You need to be special, exceptional, different. The idea of a simple, quiet life feels like failure. You need your life to be impressive, your achievements to be noteworthy, your story to be heroic. Michael couldn't imagine retiring, slowing down, living simply. That felt like giving up, like becoming irrelevant, like admitting defeat. He needed to be exceptional, or he was nothing. Spiritual materialism. Even your spiritual or personal development work has become another achievement game. You're not meditating to connect with yourself. You're meditating to become more conscious than others. You're not in therapy to heal. You're in therapy to optimize yourself. You've turned inner work into another form of conquest, another way to be the hero. Michael had done years of personal development, but it was all achievement-oriented. He wanted to be the most conscious entrepreneur, the most integrated leader, the guy who's done more inner work than anyone. He'd turned even spiritual growth into heroic identity. This is the hero trap in full force, and it's particularly insidious because culture rewards it, celebrates it, calls it success. No one tells you that compulsive achievement is pathological. No one warns you that heroic identity becomes a prison. No one explains that there's supposed to be an evolution beyond the hero, except Jung. Jung saw it clearly. He explained that the hero archetype has a shadow side, what he called inflation. When you identify too strongly with the hero, you become inflated, grandiose, unable to see your limitations, addicted to the heroic role. And he warned, identification with the hero is dangerous because it leads to a dissociation from the self. The ego inflates, thinking it is the center of everything, while actually becoming more and more separated from the deeper organizing principle of wholeness. The more you identify as the hero, the more you lose touch with your actual self. The more you achieve, the further you get from who you truly are. The conquest itself becomes the thing separating you from actualization. Michael's breakthrough came during his wife's ultimatum. She said something that shattered his entire identity. You think you're the hero of your story, but you're not. You're just running. You've been running from yourself for 20 years, and you've called that running success. But it's not. It's avoidance. You're terrified of who you'd be if you stopped achieving, so you keep achieving to avoid finding out. She was right. Michael was using heroic achievement to avoid the real work, descending into himself, facing what he'd been running from, discovering who he was beneath the performance. The hero identity was a defense mechanism, a very sophisticated, culturally rewarded defense mechanism, but still a defense against authentic self-knowing. So how do you escape the hero trap? How do you evolve beyond heroic identity into what Jung called individuation, the shift from hero to human, from proving to being? The hero is always proving his worth, proving his competence, proving he's enough. The evolved man has nothing to prove. He simply is. His worth isn't tied to achievement. His okayness doesn't depend on conquest. He exists as himself, whole whether he achieves or not. Michael had to learn this painfully. He took a sabbatical, something his ego resisted intensely. For 6 months, he did nothing that could be called achievement. No businesses, no writing, no mentoring, just being. Gardening, walking, reading for pleasure, spending time with his wife. His ego screamed that he was wasting time, falling behind, becoming irrelevant, but his self knew. This is the work now, learning to be instead of constantly doing, from conquering to cultivating. The hero conquers mountains, challenges, competitors, markets. The evolved man cultivates relationships, depth, wisdom, inner life. The hero takes. The mature masculine nurtures. Michael shifted from building companies to tending what he'd already built, from adding more to deepening what existed, from conquest to cultivation. It felt strange at first, non-productive, like he was giving up. But it was actually growth, just growth that doesn't show up on metrics, from independence to interdependence. The hero values independence above all, self-reliance, not needing anyone, being strong alone. The evolved man understands interdependence, that strength includes vulnerability, that connection is power, that needing others is healthy. Michael had prided himself on independence. Self-made was his identity. He didn't need anyone, but that independence was also isolation, loneliness, disconnection. Learning to actually need his wife, to depend on friends, to be vulnerable in relationships. This was harder than building any business, but it was the real work. From linear achievement to cyclical wisdom. The hero believes in constant forward progress. Always up and to the right, always improving, always advancing. The evolved man understands cycles, seasons of growth and rest, times of expansion and integration, the wisdom of fallow periods. Michael learned that rest isn't stagnation, that integration is as valuable as achievement, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. His entire paradigm shifted from linear progress to cyclical wisdom, from heroic identity to authentic self. This is the ultimate shift. The hero's identity is based on what he does, what he achieves, what he conquers. The evolved man's identity is based on who he is, his authentic self, independent of achievement. Michael had to face the terrifying question, who am I if I'm not achieving? At first, the answer was nothing, just void, emptiness, terror. But beneath that terror was something he'd been avoiding his entire life, his actual self. Not the hero character he'd been performing, but the real human beneath. Tender, uncertain, complex, alive. Meeting that self was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant the death of the hero identity he'd built his entire life around. Liberating because it meant finally being real instead of performing. Jung described this perfectly. The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains its equilibrium just as the body does. Every process that goes too far immediately and inevitably calls forth compensations. The compensation for excessive heroism is collapse, breakdown, forced rest. Michael's body was trying to force this compensation for years. Exhaustion, stress symptoms, illness. But he kept overriding it with heroic willpower. Until his wife's ultimatum forced what his body couldn't, a reckoning with the cost of heroic identity. Here's what Michael learned that changed everything. Achievement and actualization are not the same thing. You can achieve everything and actualize nothing. You can build empires externally while remaining undeveloped internally. You can conquer the world while losing your soul. Achievement is external. Actualization is internal. Achievement is about doing. Actualization is about becoming. Achievement satisfies ego. Actualization aligns with self. The hero trap confuses the two. It tells you that achievement is actualization, that building externally means growing internally, that conquering challenges equals psychological maturation. But Jung was clear. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not to achieve everything, not to conquer every mountain, to become, to actualize, to individuate. And that individuation often requires stopping the heroic journey, releasing heroic identity, and doing the harder work of actually becoming yourself. Here's the mirror effect for this chain. The heroes you admire reveal what you're using achievement to avoid. The accomplished men you look up to, the successful figures you emulate, look at them closely. Are they actually individuated, or are they trapped in heroic performance? Are they whole or just successful? Are they being themselves or playing the hero character? Your heroes reveal your values. And if all your heroes are defined by achievement rather than actualization, you're likely trapped in the same pattern. Michael realized the men he'd admired, CEOs, thought leaders, high achievers, most of them were trapped in the same hero cycle he was. Successful but not whole. Accomplished but not actualized. Impressive but not real. The real heroes, he discovered, were different. They were the men who'd achieved and then evolved beyond achievement, who'd been heroes and then became human, who'd built empires and then learned to be present, who'd conquered mountains and then discovered the greater challenge was cultivating depth. Those were the actual models, not the endless achievers, but the men who'd evolved beyond heroism into something more whole. So here's what I need you to understand. If you're still in the hero phase, if achievement is still your primary mode, if you're still defining yourself through conquest, you're not at the pinnacle of masculine development. You're at the beginning of the second half of the journey. The real work is ahead of you. And it's harder than any external achievement because it requires something the hero never develops. The courage to be ordinary, the strength to be vulnerable, the power to simply be instead of constantly do. Jung said it with perfect clarity. The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, only outgrown. This outgrowing proves to be a new level of consciousness. You don't solve the hero trap by achieving more perfectly. You outgrow it by evolving to a new level of consciousness. Post-heroic consciousness. Actualization over achievement. Being over doing. That evolution is the hardest work you'll ever do, because it requires killing the hero identity you've built your entire life around. It requires admitting that everything you've been striving for might not be what your soul actually needs. It requires stopping, being still, and asking the question you've been avoiding. Who am I when I'm not achieving? Who am I beneath the performance? What does my actual self want, not just what my heroic ego desires? The hero trap is the eighth and final chain, and it's the one that can capture you even after you've done all the other work, even after you've integrated shadow, healed wounds, connected with self. You can still be trapped in heroic performance, still confusing conquest with consciousness, still achieving instead of actualizing. But when you break this final chain, when you evolve beyond heroic identity into authentic selfhood, when you stop performing and start being, everything changes. Not externally necessarily. You might still achieve, still build, still create. But the motivation is different. The quality is different. The relationship to it is different. You're no longer the hero conquering mountains. You're a human being expressing your authentic self in the world. Not to prove anything, not to validate yourself, not to maintain an identity, just because that's who you are, just because that's your expression, just because that's your soul's work. That's what lies beyond the hero trap. Not perfect enlightenment, not complete actualization, but authenticity, wholeness, the lived experience of being yourself instead of performing a character. And now that you've seen all 8 chains, persona, shadow, anima, father wound, collective conditioning, fear of dissent, self-disconnection, and heroic trap. Now that you understand the invisible prison you've been living in, there's one question remaining. What do you do with this knowledge? How do you actually integrate it? How do you walk the path of individuation instead of just understanding it intellectually? That's where we're going next. The integration test, the actual practice, the lived reality of becoming who you truly are.